The woman who stepped off the train in Silver Creek, Montana that frozen December morning carried three things: a carpet bag, burn scars hidden beneath wool sleeves, and the blood of a man she'd left for dead in Chicago. Leora Vale had spent 6 months running from Vincent Mercer, the monster who believed he owned her body and soul. Now, miles from civilization, in a dying frontier town, she'd made a choice more dangerous than murder. She'd stopped running. What she didn't know was that the hardened rancher offering her shelter was drowning in his own nightmare, and the decision to stay would cost them both everything. Before we begin, if you're enjoying this story, please hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these tales travel across the world. The train's whistle cut through the Montana darkness like a scream. Leora Vale pressed her gloved hand against the frozen window, watching Silver Creek materialize through the snow. A collection of sagging buildings barely worthy of the word town. 20 structures at most. Maybe fewer. The kind of place people pass through on their way to somewhere that mattered. Perfect. She'd chosen Silver Creek precisely because it didn't matter. Because men like Vincent Mercer hunted women in cities where society gathered, where gossip traveled fast and photographs appeared in newspapers. Out here, on the bleeding edge of civilization, a woman could disappear into the wilderness like smoke. If she was careful, if she was lucky, if he didn't find her first. The train lurched to a stop with a metallic shriek that made her flinch. Through the window, she could see the station, a wooden platform barely distinguishable from the snowdrifts surrounding it. Two figures stood in the wind, collars pulled high against the cold. One was a woman in a practical wool coat. The other was a man, broad-shouldered and still, watching the train with the patience of someone who'd learned to expect disappointment. Leora gathered her carpet bag and stood on legs that trembled from more than just the journey. 6 months. 6 months since she'd driven that kitchen knife into Vincent's shoulder and run while he screamed threats that still woke her gasping in the night. The newspapers had been silent about the incident. Vincent's family money bought silence the way other men bought cattle. But she knew he was alive. Men like Vincent didn't die from one desperate woman's blade. They just got angrier. The conductor appeared at her elbow, an older man with kind eyes that had seen too many scared women heading west. "Miss, this is your stop. Thank you." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "You meeting someone?" "I hope so." She stepped onto the platform and the wind hit her like a fist. Montana winter. She'd read about it in Chicago, sitting in the rooming house where she'd hidden after fleeing Vincent's brownstone, planning her escape with the methodical desperation of a woman who knew one mistake meant death. But reading about frontier cold and experiencing it were entirely different things. The woman in the wool coat approached first, moving with the brisk efficiency of someone who didn't waste time on pleasantries. She was perhaps 40, with weathered skin and eyes that assessed Leora the way a buyer might evaluate livestock. "You Miss Vale?" "Yes." "I'm Margaret Thorne. I run the boarding house. Got your wire 3 weeks back." She gestured toward the man standing several feet away, still watching with that unsettling stillness. "That's Rowan Cade. He owns Blackthorn Ranch." Leora turned to face him properly. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with dark hair showing gray at the temples despite looking no older than 35. His face was all hard angles, sharp jaw, prominent cheekbones, deep-set eyes that held absolutely no warmth. He wore a heavy coat that had seen better years and gloves with split seams. Everything about him suggested a man holding on by his fingernails. "Mr. Cade?" She extended her hand. He looked at it for a long moment before shaking briefly. His grip was calloused, impersonal. "You the baker?" "Yes." "You worked in restaurants before?" "In Chicago, 3 years at the Palmer House." The lie came easily now. She'd practiced it enough. "References?" "Lost in a fire." Another lie. There'd been no fire, just Vincent's connections that made requesting references from her actual employers impossible. Rowan's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or suspicion? Convenient. "Not particularly." She met his gaze without flinching. "It's made finding work difficult." Margaret cleared her throat. "Rowan, you've been looking for a cook for 4 months. You're not exactly drowning in applicants." He continued studying Leora with an intensity that made her want to step backward. Finally, he nodded once. Ranch is 11 miles north. We leave in 10 minutes. You need anything from town, get it now. I have everything I need. We'll see. He turned and walked toward a wagon hitched to two massive horses, both looking as worn down as their owner. Margaret touched Leora's arm gently. Don't mind him. He's not always this charming. How charming is he usually? Less. Margaret smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. You sure about this? Blackthorn Ranch it's not an easy place. Rowan's been barely holding it together since his wife died 2 years back. The hands are good men, but they're tired. The land's hard. And his daughter... She stopped abruptly. Leora's chest tightened. The advertisement had mentioned cooking for ranch hands. Nothing about a child. He has a daughter? Elsie. 6 years old. She was there when her mother died, kicked by a horse in the yard. The child watched the whole thing. Margaret's voice dropped. She hasn't spoken since. The wind gusted harder and Leora pulled her coat tighter, feeling the familiar ache in her left arm, where Vincent's cigar burns had healed into puckered scars. A motherless child who'd witnessed death. A desperate rancher drowning in whatever grief and debt had carved those lines into his face. A place so isolated, even monsters from Chicago might not find it. The job is still available? She asked. Far as I know, but Leora... Margaret hesitated. Whatever you're running from, Montana's big enough to hide in. But it's also small enough that secrets don't stay buried forever. If you bring trouble to Rowan's door, he won't forgive it. That man's been through enough. I'm not bringing trouble. I'm looking for a fresh start. Margaret studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Then I hope you find it. Come by the boarding house when you get a day off. I make decent coffee, and I'm always up for company. Thank you. The wagon ride to Blackthorn Ranch was brutal and silent. Rowan drove without speaking, his attention fixed on the rutted road that wound through wilderness so vast and empty it made Leora's breath catch. Snow-covered plains stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by the occasional stand of skeletal trees. The sky pressed down like a lead weight, gray and pregnant with more snow. Chicago had been noise and bodies and filth packed so tightly you could barely breathe. This was the opposite. Silence so complete it rang in her ears, emptiness so absolute she felt like the only person left alive. After an hour, Rowan finally spoke. You know how to bake bread? Yes. Not just basic loaves. The hands need food that'll stick to their ribs. We're working cattle through winter. They're burning energy faster than I can feed them. I can make whatever you need. Kitchen's been neglected. My wife... He stopped, jaw working. It's been neglected. You'll need to clean it before you can use it properly. That's fine. Pay is $20 a month plus room and board. You eat what the hands eat. Your room's above the kitchen. It's small. I don't need much space. There's rules. His voice hardened. You keep to yourself. No entertaining visitors, no drinking, no stepping foot in the main house unless I specifically ask you to. And you stay away from Elsie. The last rule landed like a slap. Your daughter? Leora asked carefully. That's not your concern. She's not your concern. You're here to cook, that's all. He snapped the reins harder than necessary, and the horses picked up speed. Are we clear? Leora thought about the nightmare that had chased her across 1,000 miles, about Vincent's hands around her throat, and his voice promising she'd never escape him, about the desperation that had driven her to take this job in the middle of nowhere with a man who'd just made it crystal clear she was hired help and nothing more. We're clear, she said quietly. They didn't speak again for the rest of the journey. Blackthorn Ranch appeared just as twilight bled across the horizon. The main house was a 2-story structure that might have been impressive once, but now sagged with neglect. Peeling paint, broken shutters, a porch that listed to one side. Outbuildings clustered around it like remora fish, a massive barn, a bunkhouse, a chicken coop, and a small structure that must be the kitchen house. Cattle pens stretched into the distance, mostly empty. A few horses stood in a corral, watching their arrival with disinterest. The whole place radiated exhaustion. Rowan pulled the wagon to a stop near the kitchen house and climbed down without offering to help her. Kitchen's there, your room's upstairs. I'll have one of the hands bring your bag. Leora climbed down carefully, her legs stiff from the cold and the ride. When do you want me to start? You started the moment you accepted the job. Hands eat at 6. Breakfast needs to be ready by 5:30. He checked his pocket watch. That gives you about 12 hours to make the kitchen usable. Can you do it? She looked at the small building, then back at him. His face was impassive, but she could see the challenge in his eyes. The assumption that she'd fail. That she was just another desperate woman who'd run back to town at the first sign of real work. "I'll have breakfast ready," she said. Something shifted in his expression, too quick to identify. "We'll see." He walked toward the main house without looking back. The kitchen was worse than she'd expected. The moment Leora stepped inside, she was hit by the smell. Spoiled food, mouse droppings, something rotten in the walls. The single room was maybe 20 feet square, with a massive iron stove dominating one wall, a work table in the center covered with debris, and shelves lined with supplies in various states of decay. Dishes were piled in a dry sink crusted with filth. The floor was sticky with spilled grease and tracked-in mud. A narrow staircase led to what must be her room. For a long moment, Leora stood in the doorway, carpet bag in hand, staring at the disaster. This wasn't just neglect. This was grief made visible. A man who'd stopped caring about the daily details of survival because the woman who'd managed them was gone. She thought about the train that had brought her here, about Margaret's boarding house in town, about running again. Then she set down her bag, rolled up her sleeves despite the burn scars she normally kept hidden, and got to work. The next 12 hours passed in a blur of brutal physical labor. She started by opening every window despite the cold, letting the frozen air chase out the worst of the stink. Then she built a fire in the stove. It took 6 tries because the chimney was clogged with birds' nests and heated water. Lots of water. The dishes came first. She washed until her hands were raw and bleeding, scrubbing away layers of accumulated filth. Mice had been living in the dish pile. She found 3 dead ones and carried them out by their tails, trying not to gag. Next came the floor. She scrubbed on her hands and knees with lye soap and scalding water until the boards showed their original color. Her back screamed, her knees ached. She didn't stop. The work table required a knife to scrape off the worst of the grime before she could actually clean it. The shelves were next. She threw out anything that had gone bad, which was most of it, and reorganized what remained into something approaching logical order. By midnight, the kitchen was clean enough to use. By 2 in the morning, she'd taken inventory of the remaining supplies and made a mental list of what she'd need to request. By 4, she was mixing bread dough with hands that shook from exhaustion. She worked by lamplight in the freezing kitchen, her breath misting in the air despite the fire she kept burning. The dough came together under her palms, flour, water, salt, the smallest bit of precious yeast she'd found in a jar on the top shelf. She shaped it into loaves with mechanical precision, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought had failed. Vincent used to stand behind her in his Chicago kitchen, breathing down her neck while she baked, correcting every tiny mistake, slapping her hands when she was too slow, pressing his body against hers in ways that made her skin crawl, while he whispered that she should be grateful for his attention, his instruction, his ownership. She had learned to bake perfectly under those conditions. Now in this freezing frontier kitchen, thousands of miles from that nightmare, she baked for herself. The loaves went into the oven at 5. While they baked, she cooked breakfast, salt pork fried crisp, potatoes roasted with the last of some dried rosemary she'd found, scrambled eggs from the hen house where she'd stolen out in the dark to rob confused chickens. Coffee boiled in a massive pot on the back of the stove, strong enough to strip paint. At exactly 5:30, she heard boots on the porch. The door swung open and men filed in, 5 of them, all looking like they'd been worked half to death. They stopped when they saw the clean kitchen, saw the food laid out on the table, saw Leora standing there in a borrowed apron with flour in her hair. The oldest one, a grizzled cowboy with a magnificent mustache, recovered first. "Well, hell." "Breakfast is ready," Leora said. "Please sit." They sat slowly, exchanging glances that ranged from suspicious to cautiously hopeful. She served them without ceremony, piling plates high with food, pouring coffee into clean mugs, setting the breadbasket in the center of the table. The mustached cowboy picked up a slice of bread, still warm from the oven. He studied it like it might be a trick. Then he took a bite. His eyes closed. "Christ," he muttered. The others dug in. For several minutes, there was nothing but the sound of eating, desperate, hungry men consuming food that actually tasted like someone had cared about making it. Leora stood by the stove, watching and trying not to show how much their reaction affected her. Finally, the mustached cowboy looked up. Ma'am, I'm Dutch Cooper. I run the day crew. That's James, Tomas, young Bill, and Charlie. He gestured to each man in turn. We've been eating hardtack and beans for the better part of 6 months. He gestured at his empty plate. This is the best damn breakfast I've had since Mrs. Cade died. Leora felt her throat tighten. Thank you. Boss said he hired a baker. Didn't mention she was a miracle worker. It's just food. No, ma'am. Dutch shook his head firmly. It ain't, and I suspect you know that. The kitchen door opened again and Rowan walked in. He stopped just inside the threshold, taking in the scene, the clean kitchen, the fed men, the smell of fresh bread. His gaze found Leora and held for a long moment. She couldn't read his expression. Morning, boss, Dutch said carefully. Miss Vale here made us breakfast. I can see that. Rowan's voice was neutral. You men need to get moving. Cattle won't feed themselves. They rose quickly, mumbling thanks to Leora as they filed out. Dutch was the last to leave, pausing at the door. Lunch at noon, ma'am. Don't go to any trouble. I'll have something ready. When they were gone, Rowan remained standing by the door. The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled taut. Kitchen looks different, he said finally. I cleaned it. All night? Most of it. He crossed to the table and picked up one of the remaining bread rolls. He didn't eat it, just held it, turning it over in his scarred hands. My wife used to make bread. Not like this, but she tried. Leora said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like she was trying to replace a dead woman. The rule about staying away from Elsie, Rowan said, still looking at the bread. I meant it. I understand. Do you? His eyes snapped to her face. My daughter watched her mother die. She hasn't spoken in 2 years. Every doctor in 3 counties says there's nothing physically wrong with her. It's grief or shock or something they can't fix. She doesn't need some stranger trying to mother her. I wasn't planning to. Good. Keep it that way. He set the bread down and walked toward the door, then stopped. Breakfast was acceptable. Have lunch ready at noon. He was gone before she could respond. Leora stood in the clean kitchen, surrounded by empty plates and the lingering warmth from the stove, and tried not to think about how a man could praise and dismiss her in the same breath. Tried not to wonder about the little girl locked somewhere in that big house, with a father who was drowning in his own grief. She had her own survival to worry about. That was enough. The pattern established itself quickly over the next few days. Leora woke before dawn, built up the fire, and cooked breakfast for men who were slowly starting to trust that she wouldn't disappear in the night. She prepared lunch and dinner with whatever supplies she could scrape together from the depleted pantry. She baked bread constantly. The hands consumed it faster than she'd thought possible, sometimes eating half a loaf in one sitting. Between meals, she explored her small room above the kitchen. It was exactly as advertised. Small. A narrow bed, a washstand, a single window that looked out toward the main house. But it was clean, and it was hers, and nobody was going to hurt her here. She unpacked her carpet bag carefully, hanging her 2 spare dresses on hooks, tucking her few personal items into the washstand drawer. At the very bottom of the bag, wrapped in an old pillowcase, was the thing she'd carried from Chicago. The knife. The same kitchen knife she'd driven into Vincent's shoulder. She should have thrown it away. Should have left it in that Chicago alley where she'd dropped it after running from his brownstone. But something had made her go back for it. Some animal instinct that knew the world was dangerous and a woman alone needed teeth. She hid it under the mattress and tried not to think about why she might need it again. The ranch revealed itself in pieces. From her window she watched the hands working from dawn to dusk, moving cattle, mending fences, breaking ice on water troughs. The work was endless and clearly undermanned. Dutch had mentioned they'd lost 3 cowboys over the summer, couldn't afford to pay them. She never saw Elsie, never saw Rowan except at mealtimes when he appeared briefly to eat standing up near the door, as if sitting down might trap him in human company too long. But she heard things. The hands talked while they ate, and she learned to listen while appearing not to. Learned that Rowan's wife had been named Catherine, that she'd been beautiful and kind, and had held the ranch together through sheer force of will while Rowan worked the land, that her death had broken something fundamental in him. Learned that Blackthorn Ranch was drowning in debt to a man named Silas Pritchard, who owned half the territory and wanted the other half. Learned that this winter was make or break. If they lost too many cattle to the cold, The bank would foreclose and Pritchard would swallow the land whole. Learned that everyone was terrified, but nobody would say it out loud. On her fourth night at the ranch, Leora woke to screaming. She bolted upright in bed, heart hammering, momentarily convinced that Vincent had found her, that his men were downstairs, that everything was ending. But no. The screaming wasn't downstairs. It was coming from the main house. A child screaming. Elsie. Leora was out of bed and down the stairs before conscious thought caught up with her body. She ran across the frozen yard in her nightgown and bare feet, following the sound of terror that was so familiar it made her chest ache. The main house door was unlocked. She burst through into darkness broken only by lamplight flickering from upstairs. The screaming got louder, not words, just raw sounds of absolute fear. She took the stairs 3 at a time. The second-floor hallway had 3 doors. The screaming came from behind the middle one. Leora shoved it open. The room was small and decorated with the faded remnants of childhood. A dollhouse, a hobby horse, curtains with little flowers. In the center, a tiny figure thrashed in bed, tangled in blankets, making sounds like an animal caught in a trap. Rowan was there, standing helplessly beside the bed, hands hovering over his daughter, like he wanted to touch her, but didn't know how. His face was ravaged with the kind of pain that had no remedy. "Elsie, baby, wake up," he was saying desperately. "Please, wake up." The child screamed louder. Leora didn't think. She crossed the room, dropped to her knees beside the bed, and gathered the thrashing little girl into her arms. "Hey," she said softly, holding Elsie against her chest. "Hey, you're safe. You're safe. I've got you." Elsie fought for a moment, small fists pounding against Leora's shoulders. But Leora didn't let go. She'd been this frightened child once. She knew what terror felt like in your bones, knew how the nightmares could swallow you whole. "Shh," she murmured, rocking gently. "It was just a dream. You're safe now. Nobody's going to hurt you." Gradually, the screaming faded to sobbing. Elsie's small body went rigid, then slowly, impossibly slowly, began to relax. She didn't speak. Of course she didn't speak. But her hands gripped Leora's nightgown with desperate strength. Leora kept rocking, kept murmuring nonsense words of comfort, kept being the anchor this child needed to find her way back from whatever hell lived in her dreams. When she finally looked up, Rowan was staring at her. His expression was completely unreadable. Shock, anger, something else she couldn't name. They stayed frozen like that for a long moment. Leora kneeling on the floor holding his daughter, Rowan standing over them both like a man watching his entire world shift beneath his feet. "Get out," he finally said. His voice was quiet, deadly. "She's calming down. Get out." Leora carefully released Elsie, who immediately curled into a ball on the bed, eyes squeezed shut. She stood on shaking legs and walked to the door. Just before she left, she turned back. Rowan had sat down on the edge of the bed, his back to her, one hand hovering over his daughter's small form without quite touching her. "I'm sorry," Leora whispered. He didn't respond. She walked back to the kitchen through snow that burned her bare feet, climbed the stairs to her small room, and sat on the bed shaking. Not from cold, from the look in Rowan's eyes when he told her to leave, from the realization that she'd just broken the one rule that mattered. She expected to be fired the next morning. Instead, when she came downstairs at dawn, she found a pair of worn boots sitting on the kitchen steps. Women's boots, too big for her but lined with wool. A note was tucked inside one of them, written in harsh, angular handwriting. "For next time." Leora picked up the boots slowly, turning them over in her hands. They'd belonged to Catherine. She could tell from the way they'd been worn, shaped to someone else's feet, but carefully preserved. For next time. Not, "Don't ever do that again." Not, "You're fired." Not, "Stay away from my daughter." For next time. She laced them on her feet and went to make breakfast, and when Rowan appeared at 6 to eat standing by the door, she didn't mention the boots, and neither did he. But when he left, he took 3 pieces of her bread wrapped in a cloth napkin, and Leora understood, with the clarity of someone who'd survived by reading unspoken truths, that something had changed in the darkness of Elsie's bedroom. The war for Blackthorn Ranch's survival was about to begin, and somehow, impossibly, she'd just been drafted to fight in it. The boots became a symbol of something neither of them would name. Leora wore them every morning when she crossed the frozen yard in the pre-dawn darkness. and every night when Elsie's nightmares tore through the silence. The screaming came 3, sometimes 4 times a week, always between midnight and 3 in the morning, always the same raw terror that said the child was reliving her mother's death over and over in her sleep. And every time, Leora ran. She never asked permission, never waited for Rowan to invite her. She just went, climbed those stairs, and held that little girl until the screaming stopped and the trembling eased, and Elsie's breathing finally evened out into something approaching sleep. Rowan never thanked her, never told her to stop coming. He'd just stand there in his daughter's doorway, watching with that unreadable expression while Leora rocked his child and murmured the kind of comfort she desperately needed when she was young and terrified, and nobody came. Then he'd say, "I've got her now," and Leora would leave. It became their routine, their unspoken arrangement, and slowly, impossibly slowly, things began to shift. 2 weeks after the first nightmare, Leora was pulling fresh bread from the oven when she heard small footsteps on the kitchen porch. She turned and found Elsie standing in the doorway, tiny and solemn in a dress that had been mended so many times the original fabric was barely visible. The child didn't speak, just stood there, watching. "Hello," Leora said quietly, the way she might approach a wild animal. "Are you hungry?" Elsie didn't respond, but she didn't run either. Leora cut a thick slice of bread, still warm, and spread it with butter and a precious spoonful of honey she'd been hoarding. She set it on the table and stepped back, giving the child space. Elsie crept forward like she expected the floor to open beneath her. She picked up the bread with both hands and took a small, careful bite. Her eyes went wide. "Good?" Leora asked. The child nodded once, sharp and certain, then took another bite. She ate the entire piece standing up, never taking her eyes off Leora. When she finished, she set the plate down carefully and ran. But the next morning, she came back. This time she stayed longer, sat at the table while Leora kneaded dough, didn't speak, but watched everything with those huge eyes that had seen too much death for someone so small. The third morning, she brought a gift. It was a rock, smooth and gray and utterly ordinary. Elsie set it on the work table beside where Leora was rolling out biscuit dough, then stepped back quickly, like she might get punished for the offering. Leora picked up the rock and studied it like it was a diamond. "This is beautiful. Did you find it by the creek?" Elsie nodded. "Can I keep it?" Another nod, more enthusiastic this time. "Thank you." Leora set the rock on the windowsill where morning light caught it. "I'll put it right here so I can see it while I work." Something that might have been a smile flickered across the child's face. Then she was gone again, small feet pattering across the porch and back toward the main house. But she'd be back tomorrow. Leora knew it with the same certainty she knew how to make bread rise. The gifts kept coming. A pine cone, a blue jay feather, a piece of bottle glass worn smooth by the creek. Elsie never explained them, never spoke, but each one was placed carefully beside the previous offerings on the windowsill. Leora treasured every single one. She knew what they meant. She'd been a silent child once too, after her father died and her mother remarried a man who believed discipline meant violence. She'd learned that words were dangerous, that speaking up got you hurt, that the only safe communication was the kind that couldn't be punished. These gifts were Elsie's way of saying, "I trust you," without using the words she no longer had. Rowan noticed. Of course he noticed. He appeared in the kitchen one morning while Leora was frying bacon and Elsie was sitting at the table drawing pictures in the flour Leora had spilled. He stood in the doorway watching them, and when Leora looked up, his expression was complicated. Relief and resentment tangled together so tightly she couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. "She's bothering you," he said. "She's not. If she is, she's not." Leora met his gaze steadily. "She's welcome here anytime she wants to come." Something worked in his jaw. "You don't have to do this." "Do what?" "Pretend to care." His voice was flat, brutal in its honesty. "You're hired help. You don't owe us anything beyond cooking." The words stung more than they should have. Leora turned back to the bacon, flipping strips that sizzled and spat grease. "I'm not pretending anything, Mr. Cade. Your daughter comes to my kitchen. I give her bread. That's all that's happening here." "Is it?" "What else would it be?" He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer but somehow more dangerous. My wife used to say I didn't know how to accept help. She was right, but I'm trying to warn you. Elsie's been through enough. If you're just passing through, if you're going to leave when something better comes along, it's kinder to keep your distance now. Leora set down the spatula and turned to face him fully. Are you asking me to stop letting her visit? I'm asking what your plan is. How long you're staying? I don't know, she said honestly. I didn't have a plan beyond getting here. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have. They stared at each other across the kitchen while bacon smoke curled between them and Elsie hummed tunelessly at the table, drawing patterns in flour that looked like flowers, or maybe stars. The moment stretched thin and tight. Finally, Rowan nodded once, sharp and dismissive. Breakfast smells good. He was gone before she could respond, but Elsie stayed and kept coming back. And slowly, day by day, the child's presence became woven into the fabric of Leora's routine as naturally as breathing. The ranch's real crisis made itself known on a Tuesday. Leora was preparing lunch when Dutch came into the kitchen looking like he'd aged 10 years overnight. The other hands followed, their faces grim. What's wrong? She asked. Dutch pulled off his hat and turned it in his hands, a nervous gesture she'd learned meant bad news. We lost 43 head last night. The number hit like a fist. How? Fence came down in the north pasture during that storm. Cattle wandered onto Pritchard land. By the time we found them this morning, his men had already branded them with his mark. That's theft, Leora said. That's frontier law, ma'am. Cattle wander onto your land. You can claim them if they ain't branded proper. Ours were branded, but Pritchard's saying the marks were altered, that we tried to steal from him first. That's insane. Can't you prove? Prove what? Young Bill interrupted bitterly. We're barely holding on. Pritchard owns the bank, the sheriff, half the county. Who's going to take our word against his? Dutch shot him a look that said, shut up, but the damage was done. The other hands were nodding, resignation settling over them like snow. Where's Rowan? Leora asked. Rode to town to meet with the bank. Again. Dutch's voice was heavy. We're 3 months behind on the loan. Losing 43 head means we can't make next month's payment either. Bank's going to call it due. And when they do, Pritchard forecloses, Tomas finished quietly. He's been waiting for this. The kitchen fell silent except for the soup bubbling on the stove. Leora looked at these exhausted men who'd been fighting a losing battle for months, maybe years, and felt something cold and familiar settle in her chest. She knew what it was like to be trapped by someone with more power and money and connections. Knew what it felt like when the whole system was rigged against you and fighting back seemed impossible. Vincent had owned everything in her world too. Owned the restaurant where she worked, owned the building where she lived, owned the police who looked the other way when she showed up with bruises. He'd made her believe escape was impossible, but she'd escaped anyway. How much does the ranch owe? She asked. Dutch blinked. Ma'am? The bank loan. How much? I don't think that's... How much? He exchanged glances with the other hands. Finally, $1,500. Plus another $1,000 in operating costs we're behind on. Feed, supplies, wages. He laughed without humor. We haven't been paid in 2 months. Boss keeps promising, but there ain't nothing to pay us with. Leora did the math quickly. $1,500 for the loan, $1,000 for operations. Plus whatever they needed to survive the rest of winter and rebuild the cattle herd. Call it $3,000 total. An impossible amount. Unless. The bread, she said slowly. Dutch frowned. Ma'am, how much bread do I make every day? I don't know, maybe 6, 7 loaves? And you men eat how much of it? Most of it. He was still frowning, not following her logic. Sometimes all of it. Leora walked to the window and stared out at the struggling ranch, her mind working through calculations. She'd worked in the Palmer House kitchen for 3 years. She knew what rich people would pay for good bread, knew that scarcity increased value, knew that a product tied to a compelling story could sell for triple what it was actually worth. And if there was one thing the frontier loved, it was a good story. What if we sold it? She said. Sold what? The bread. To the railroad camps, the mining towns, the settlements. Fresh bread delivered 3 times a week. She turned to face them. How many towns are within a day's ride? Dutch was staring at her like she'd started speaking a foreign language. Maybe 8 or 9. But ma'am, people bake their own tea. Not like this, they don't. And not in the middle of winter when flour is expensive and fuel is scarce, and most frontier women are too exhausted from surviving to bake properly. She was talking faster now, the idea taking shape. We position it as a luxury. Ranch-baked bread from Montana cattle country. We charge premium prices and deliver on a schedule. You're talking about a business, young Bill said slowly. I'm talking about survival. Boss would never agree to it, Dutch said. He's a cattleman. He ain't going to turn this place into a bakery. Then we won't ask him. Leora's voice was hard. We'll just do it. The kitchen went quiet. The men shifted uncomfortably, looking at each other with expressions that said they thought she'd lost her mind. Finally, Dutch spoke carefully. Ma'am, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but there's a lot of problems with this idea. We don't have money for supplies. We don't have wagons to deliver. We don't have time. We're already working 16-hour days just keeping the ranch running. And even if we solved all that, $3,000 is— I know it's impossible, Leora interrupted. Everything worth doing is impossible until somebody does it anyway. She must have sounded like a crazy woman. A Chicago baker who'd been on the ranch for less than 3 weeks, proposing to save it with bread. But she'd spent 6 months running from a man everyone said was too powerful to escape, and she'd done it anyway. If you were already falling, you might as well fall toward something instead of away from everything. Dutch studied her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him. You know what, ma'am? I think you might be crazy enough to pull this off. What do you need? Flour, yeast, salt, sugar, butter, eggs beyond what the chickens give us. Dried fruit if we can get it. She was already making lists in her head. And I need someone who can drive a wagon and sell. I can do that, young Bill volunteered. Used to work in my daddy's store back in Kansas. I know how to talk people into buying things they don't need. We'll need to increase production gradually, Leora continued, the plan crystallizing. Start with one town. Build a customer base. Then expand. But it has to be quality. If we sell garbage, we're done before we start. Tomas leaned forward. What about boss? He's going to notice when we start hauling bread to town. Let me handle Rowan, Leora said with more confidence than she felt. That evening, she waited until dinner was finished and the hands had retreated to the bunkhouse. Then she knocked on the main house door. Rowan answered looking exhausted, his shirt sleeves rolled up and ink staining his fingers. Behind him, she could see papers spread across a table, ledgers, bills, notices from the bank. What is it? He asked. I need to talk to you about the ranch. His expression hardened. That's not your concern. Dutch told me about the cattle, about Pritchard. Dutch talks too much. He's worried. They're all worried. She stepped closer, refusing to be intimidated by the way he filled the doorway. I have an idea. I don't need ideas. I need time and money, and I've run out of both. Then what's your plan? She heard her voice rise and fought to control it. Just wait for the bank to foreclose? Let Pritchard win? What I do is none of your business. His voice was ice. You're the cook. Cook! I'm trying to help. I didn't ask for help. No, you just asked everyone to stand around watching while everything falls apart. The words came out sharper than she intended, fueled by frustration and fear and the memory of every time someone had told her to accept defeat. You think you're the only person who's ever lost something? The only one who knows what it's like when powerful men rig the system against you. Something dangerous flashed in his eyes. You don't know anything about my situation. I know you have 43 fewer cattle than you had yesterday. I know the bank is going to foreclose. I know you haven't paid your men in 2 months and they're still here because they believe in you, even though you've apparently given up on yourself. Get off my porch. I can save this ranch, she said desperately. He laughed, a bitter, broken sound. With what? Bread? Yes. The word hung between them. Rowan stared at her like she was insane. Maybe she was. Maybe running from Chicago had broken something in her brain that made her think a woman with nothing could take on a system designed to crush people like her. But she'd done it once. She could do it again. Let me try, she said quietly. What do you have to lose? My pride, my dignity. The last shred of respect I have left. His voice was harsh. You want to turn my ranch into a charity case? Let the whole territory know Rowan Cade couldn't make it as a cattleman, so he's selling bread like some... Like some what? Her voice went very cold. Like some woman? He had the grace to look uncomfortable. I'm not asking you to give up cattle, Leora continued. I'm asking you to let me help while you figure out how to save them, unless your pride is more important than your daughter's future. The mention of Elsie hit him like she'd known it would. His jaw clenched and something painful crossed his face. How? He asked finally. Give me money for supplies, let young Bill drive a wagon to town twice a week, and stay out of my way. That's it? That's your plan? That's the start of it. He scrubbed a hand over his face, and for a moment he looked less like the hard frontier rancher and more like a man drowning in water too deep to stand in. If this fails, then we're exactly where we would have been anyway. And if it succeeds, then you'll owe me nothing because I'll owe you more. She met his eyes. You gave me a place when I had nowhere else to go. Let me give you something back. Rowan was quiet for a long time, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away. But she held his gaze, letting him see whatever he needed to see to trust her. $75, he said finally. That's all I can spare for supplies. If you can do something with that, do it. If not, we tried. It wasn't enough. It was barely a start, but it was permission. I'll make it work, she said. You better. He started to close the door, then stopped. Leora. It was the first time he'd used her first name. The men respect you, he said quietly. I don't know how you did that so fast, but they do. Don't make me regret trusting you. The door closed before she could respond. She walked back to the kitchen through the freezing night, $75 suddenly feeling like the weight of the entire world, and wondered what she'd just committed herself to. The next morning, she started baking before dawn. Not the usual 6 or 7 loaves. 20 loaves. Different types. Basic white, wheat, rye with caraway seeds, sweet bread with dried apples. Her arms ached. Her back screamed. She didn't stop. Young Bill left for Silver Creek at 8 with a wagon containing 15 loaves carefully wrapped in clean cloth, plus a sign Leora had painted that read, Blackthorn Ranch Bread, fresh baked, 25 cents. The hands thought she was crazy for charging that much. Back east, bread cost maybe 5 cents a loaf. But Leora knew something they didn't. People didn't buy bread. They bought the story behind it, and a struggling ranch fighting to survive against a greedy cattle baron? That was one hell of a story. Young Bill returned at sunset looking stunned. Sold out, he announced, dumping coins on the kitchen table. Every single loaf could have sold twice as many. The coins added up to $3.75. Minus the cost of supplies, they'd profited maybe $2. It was nothing, a drop in the ocean of what they needed, but it was proof the idea could work. What did people say? Leora asked. Most wanted to know about the ranch, about Boss, about you. He grinned. I told them the story, about the widow fighting Pritchard, about his little girl, about the baker who showed up out of nowhere to help. By the end, folks were buying bread just to support the cause. Dutch, who'd been listening from the doorway, shook his head slowly. You weaponized sympathy. I weaponized truth, Leora corrected. Everything young Bill told them was real. Still, but Dutch was smiling. That's some strategic thinking, ma'am. Over the next 2 weeks, the operation expanded. Young Bill started making runs to 2 towns, then 3. Leora increased production to 30 loaves a day, then 40, working through the night while the hands slept. Her body adapted to the brutal schedule the way it had adapted to everything else, through sheer stubborn refusal to break. The money started coming in, $5 a week, then 8, then 12. It still wasn't enough, not nearly enough, but it was movement in the right direction, and that mattered. The frontier communities embraced the story. Leora started getting orders. A mining foreman wanted bread delivered to his camp weekly. A boarding house in Helena requested a standing order. A wealthy rancher's wife commissioned special occasion loaves for a dinner party. And with every sale, the legend of Blackthorn Ranch grew. People loved an underdog, loved the image of a struggling widow. Even though Rowan was a widower, the distinction got lost in retelling, fighting against corporate greed. The fact that a woman was doing the fighting made it even better. Leora didn't correct the misconceptions. Let them think what they wanted. As long as they bought bread, the truth didn't matter. But success brought complications. She needed more supplies than $75 could buy. Needed better equipment. Her mixing bowls were too small. The oven couldn't handle the volume. She was running out of storage space. Needed help because working 20-hour days was unsustainable, and she could feel her body starting to fail under the strain. And she needed to tell Rowan that his ranch was becoming famous for something other than cattle. She found him in the barn one evening, mending tack by lantern light. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression said he'd been expecting this conversation. "We need to talk," she said. "I figured." He set down the leather strap he'd been working on. "Young Bill's been making 3 runs a week. The hands are gossiping, and I'm not stupid." "I didn't think you were." "How much?" "We've made $43 in 2 weeks." He let out a long breath. "That's it?" "That's after supplies. Net profit." She moved closer, her shadow falling across his workspace. "But I can do better. If I had better equipment, more help, and about $100 for inventory, I could triple production, maybe quadruple it." "I don't have $100. "I know. That's why I think we should take out a second loan." The words fell like stones into water. Rowan stared at her. "Are you insane? We're drowning in the debt we already have. We're drowning because we're trying to survive on cattle in a rigged game. This is different. This is bread. This is income, reliable income that Pritchard can't steal with a downed fence." She pulled a folded paper from her apron pocket. "I did the numbers. If we invest $100 now and scale up production, we could be making $60, maybe $80 a week within a month. That's enough to make loan payments and keep the ranch running while we rebuild the herd." He took the paper but didn't look at it. "And if it fails? Then we're bankrupt either way. But at least we tried something different. You're asking me to bet everything on bread. I'm asking you to bet on me." The barn was quiet except for the sound of horses shifting in their stalls and the wind howling outside. Rowan studied her face in the lamplight, and she wondered what he saw. A desperate woman running from her past, a con artist with a good story, or someone who actually knew what she was doing. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why do you care this much?" The question caught her off guard. She could lie, should lie, keep the walls up and the past buried where it belonged. But maybe he deserved more than that. "Because powerful men who think they own everything make me angry," she said quietly. "And because nobody helped me when I needed it most. So when I see a chance to help someone else, I take it." "That's not an answer. It's the one you're getting." They stared at each other across the space between them, and Leora felt the weight of all the things she couldn't say pressing against her ribs. About Vincent, about Chicago, about the scars on her arms and the knife under her mattress, and the nightmares that still woke her gasping. About the fact that saving this ranch had somehow become tangled up with saving herself. $100, Rowan said finally. "You really think you can turn that into something that matters?" "I know I can." He was quiet for another long moment. Then he nodded once. "I'll talk to the bank tomorrow. But if this fails, we're done. Understand? No more miracles. No more impossible plans." "Understood." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "Leora." She looked back. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For trying." It was the first time he'd thanked her for anything. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and walked back to the kitchen where 40 loaves of tomorrow's bread were waiting to be shaped. The $100 loan came through, and everything changed. Leora hired 2 women from town, a widow named Sarah and her teenage daughter, Anna, to help with production. She bought professional-grade mixing bowls, additional baking pans, and enough supplies to keep them running for a month. She expanded the menu to include specialty items, cinnamon rolls, dinner rolls, fruit tarts. Production jumped to 70 loaves a day. Young Bill recruited his brother to help with deliveries. They started running routes 6 days a week, covering 12 towns across a 100-mile radius. Money poured in. $15 a week became 30, then 50, then 75. The ranch hands watched in amazement as the kitchen transformed into a full-scale operation. Sarah and Anna arrived at 4 every morning and worked until noon. Leora coordinated everything: production schedules, delivery routes, quality control, customer service. She worked 18-hour days and fell into bed too exhausted to dream. But the numbers didn't lie. After 6 weeks, they'd made back the $100 investment and were solidly in profit. Rowan made the February loan payment to the bank for the first time in 4 months. And that's when Silas Pritchard noticed what was happening. Pritchard's man showed up on a Thursday morning when the kitchen was in full chaos. Leora was elbow-deep in dough, Sarah was pulling cinnamon rolls from the oven, and Anna was packaging yesterday's orders when the door swung open without a knock. The man who entered was tall and expensively dressed in a way that screamed city money, trying to look frontier appropriate. His boots were too clean, his coat too new. "Help you?" Leora asked, not stopping her work. "I'm looking for Rowan Cade. He's out with the cattle, won't be back until evening." The man's gaze swept the kitchen, taking in the operation with calculating eyes. "You're the baker, the one everyone's talking about." Something in his tone made Leora's spine stiffen. She'd heard that particular blend of curiosity and contempt before, men assessing whether a woman was a threat or just an amusing distraction. "I make bread. That's all." "That's not what I hear." He pulled out a silver card case and extracted a business card with movements so precise they felt rehearsed. "Calvin Morrison, I represent Mr. Silas Pritchard's business interests in the territory." The kitchen went quiet. Sarah and Anna exchanged nervous glances. "Mr. Pritchard asked me to extend an invitation," Morrison continued. "He'd like to meet with you, discuss a business proposition." "I'm not interested. You haven't heard the proposition yet." "Don't need to." Leora shaped the dough with more force than necessary. "I work for Rowan Cade. If Pritchard wants to discuss business, he can talk to him." Morrison's smile was thin and sharp. "Mr. Pritchard is prepared to offer you $500 for your bread recipes and customer list, plus a position running his commercial kitchen in Helena. Steady salary, real facilities. You'd never have to work in this." He glanced around the cramped kitchen with barely disguised disdain. Primitive setup again. $500. It was more money than Leora had ever seen in one place. Enough to disappear again, to run somewhere even Vincent couldn't find her. Enough to buy real safety instead of this precarious borrowed shelter. "No," she said. "That's a very generous offer, Miss Vale." And I said no. Morrison's expression hardened. "Mr. Pritchard doesn't make many offers. When he does, people generally have the sense to accept them." "Then I guess I don't have much sense." "Clearly." He tucked the card back into his case with deliberate slowness. "But perhaps you should think carefully about what you're refusing. Mr. Pritchard controls the banks, the suppliers, the transportation routes. This little enterprise of yours exists because he's allowed it to exist. That can change very quickly." The threat landed exactly as intended. Leora felt Sarah go rigid behind her and heard Anna's sharp intake of breath. But she'd been threatened by experts, men who knew how to make violence sound like concern. This polished corporate vulture didn't scare her. "Tell Pritchard that Blackthorn Ranch isn't for sale," she said quietly. "Not in pieces?" "Not at all." Morrison studied her for a long moment, his expression shifting from dismissive to something colder. "You're making a mistake." "Won't be my first." He left without another word, but the door closing behind him felt less like an ending and more like the cocking of a gun. Sarah set down her spatula with shaking hands. "That was Pritchard's lawyer, the one who handles his acquisitions." "I figured." "You shouldn't have said no." "Probably not." "He's going to retaliate." Sarah's voice was tight with fear. "That's what he does. When people won't sell, he finds ways to make them." Leora looked at the older woman and saw genuine terror in her eyes. "What happened to you?" "My husband owned a feed store. Pritchard wanted to buy it. Henry refused." Sarah's hands clenched in her apron. 2 weeks later, our supplier cut us off. Said Pritchard had bought their company and we were no longer approved customers. We lasted another month before we had to close. Henry died 6 months after that. The doctor said it was his heart, but I know better. Pritchard killed him just as surely as if he'd put a gun to his head. The kitchen felt suddenly colder. "I'm sorry," Leora said quietly. "Sorry doesn't change what's coming." Sarah pulled off her apron. "I need this job. Anna needs this job. But if Pritchard's coming after Blackthorn Ranch, I can't be here when it happens. I've lost too much already." "Sarah?" "I'm sorry, Leora. I really am, but I can't." She grabbed her coat and was gone before Leora could argue, pulling her daughter with her. The kitchen suddenly felt enormous and empty. Leora stood there, surrounded by half-finished bread orders and the lingering smell of Morrison's expensive cologne, and felt the familiar weight of consequences settling over her shoulders. She'd known this was coming, had known the moment they started making real money that Pritchard would notice, that men like him always noticed when someone threatened their control. She should have been more careful, should have stayed small and invisible. But she'd never been good at staying invisible. That evening, she told Rowan what had happened. He listened without interrupting, his face growing progressively harder as she described Morrison's visit and Sarah's departure. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, staring at the whiskey glass in his hand like it might hold answers. $500, he said finally. I didn't take it. I know, but you thought about it. It wasn't a question. Leora didn't insult him by denying it. For about 3 seconds. Why didn't you? Because it wasn't mine to sell. She met his gaze. And because men like Pritchard don't make generous offers, they make opening bids in hostile takeovers. Rowan's laugh was bitter. You sound like you've dealt with his type before. Something like that. He set down his glass and stood, moving to the window where he could see the ranch spread out in the fading light. This is my fault. I should have seen this coming. Should have known that the moment we started succeeding, he'd try to crush us. What do you want to do? Fight. The word was flat, exhausted. What else can I do? If I give up now, everything Catherine built dies with her. Everything we've worked for disappears. And Elsie, his voice caught. What kind of man lets his daughter watch him surrender? Then we fight, Leora said simply. He turned to look at her, really look at her, and something passed between them that felt like understanding, like recognition of a shared wound. This is going to get worse. You know that, right? Morrison was just the opening salvo. Pritchard will come at us with everything he has. I know. You could still take his offer. Get out before things get ugly. Could, won't. Why not? Because running was what she'd been doing for 6 months, and she was tired of it. Because Elsie had started smiling when Leora braided her hair in the mornings. Because the ranch hands had stopped looking at her like temporary help and started treating her like family. Because somewhere in the brutal work and the pre-dawn baking sessions and the slow building of something that mattered, she'd stopped feeling like a victim and started feeling like a person who could fight back. But she didn't say any of that, just because I'm not finished here yet. Rowan studied her for another long moment, then nodded. Then we'd better prepare for war. The retaliation started small. Their flour supplier sent a letter apologizing that they could no longer fulfill orders. They'd been acquired by a larger company with different distribution priorities. The egg vendor who'd been selling them 3 dozen a day suddenly couldn't spare any. The yeast merchant raised prices by 300% overnight. Dutch rode to 4 different towns trying to find alternative suppliers. 3 of them had mysteriously run out of stock. The 4th quoted prices so high they might as well have been made of gold. Pritchard's squeezing us, he reported grimly. Every supplier in the territory is either owned by him or scared of him. We're cut off. Leora stood in the kitchen, surrounded by the last of their supplies, maybe enough flour for 3 more days of production, yeast for 2, and felt the walls closing in. Without ingredients, the bakery died. Without the bakery, the ranch loan went unpaid. Without the loan, Pritchard foreclosed. It was a perfect trap. There has to be somewhere he doesn't control, she said. Not in Montana. Dutch pulled off his hat and ran a hand through his gray hair. I've been here 20 years. I've seen Pritchard build his empire piece by piece. He's patient and he's thorough. When he decides to own something, he owns it. Young Bill, who'd been listening from the doorway, cleared his throat. What about outside Montana? They both turned to look at him. Idaho's got suppliers, he continued. Wyoming, too. It'd mean longer trips, higher costs, but Pritchard can't control everything in 3 territories. It was a desperate plan. The additional transportation costs would eat into their profits significantly. The longer supply lines meant more risk of disruption. But desperate plans were better than no plans. How long would it take? Leora asked. 3 days there and back, maybe 4, depending on weather. That's too long. We'd run out of supplies before you got back. Then we ration what we have and I leave today. Young Bill was already grabbing his coat. I'll take the fastest horse and ride straight through. Maybe I can cut it to 2 days. That'll kill you. So will starving. He grinned, but it was strained. Besides, I'm the youngest. If anyone can do it, it's me. He left within the hour, saddlebags loaded with every dollar they could spare and a list of everything they desperately needed. While they waited, Leora cut production to 30 loaves a day, then 20, trying to stretch their dwindling supplies. Customers started complaining about delayed orders. Some canceled entirely. The money flow that had been building so steadily began to slow. On the second night, Anna showed up at the kitchen door. She looked terrified, kept glancing over her shoulder like she expected someone to jump from the shadows. I need to talk to you, alone. Leora pulled her inside and closed the door. What's wrong? My mother told me not to come, said it was too dangerous, but you've been good to us, and She took a shaky breath. Pritchard's planning something big. How do you know? I've been seeing one of his ranch hands, Jimmy. He's not a bad person, just needs the work. He told me Pritchard's furious that you're still operating. He expected you to fold after the supplier cut off. We're not folding. I know. That's the problem. Anna twisted her hands together. Jimmy said Pritchard's going to the bank tomorrow. He's going to call in all his markers, pressure them to accelerate your loan repayment. If you can't pay the full amount immediately, they'll foreclose. The words hit like a physical blow. They can't do that. We have a payment schedule. The bank president owes Pritchard favors, lots of them. And there's something in the loan contract about default triggers. If Pritchard can prove you've missed payments or violated terms, he can force acceleration. Leora thought about the 2 months they'd been behind before the bakery started making money. About the contract she'd never actually read because Rowan had handled all the banking. About how easy it would be for a powerful man to manufacture a default. When? She asked. Tomorrow afternoon. Jimmy said Pritchard's meeting with the bank at 2. Does Rowan know? I don't know. I came straight here. Leora grabbed her coat. Thank you, Anna, for warning us. Don't thank me yet. I don't know if it'll help. Anna headed for the door, then paused. Miss Vale, my mother's scared of what Pritchard might do, but I've seen what happens when nobody stands up to men like him. They just keep taking and taking until there's nothing left. So whatever you're planning, I'm with you. If you need help, you tell me. She was gone before Leora could respond. Rowan took the news about as well as expected, meaning he went very quiet and very still in a way that suggested violence barely contained. I'll ride to town tomorrow morning, he said. Talk to the bank president. Remind him that we've been making payments. That won't work. Pritchard owns him. Then what do you suggest? Leora had been thinking about that since Anna left. Thinking about power and how men like Pritchard wielded it. They used money and connections and fear to control people, but those weapons only worked in shadows, in private meetings where nobody was watching. Public pressure was different. We make this public, she said, very public. Get ahead of whatever Pritchard's planning. How? There's a journalist in Helena, works for the territorial newspaper. I've been sending him bread samples for 3 weeks. He requested them after hearing about us from a customer. He's been writing small pieces about the bakery, about the ranch. Rowan frowned. What are you saying? I'm saying we give him the real story. Everything. Pritchard trying to steal your cattle, the supplier cutoffs, the bank manipulation. We turn this into a David and Goliath narrative that the whole territory can watch. That's insane. Pritchard will destroy us. He's already trying to destroy us. At least this way we fight back. Leora leaned forward. People love an underdog, Rowan. They love seeing the little guy stand up to the powerful. If we can get public opinion on our side, Pritchard can't just crush us quietly. He'll have to do it in front of everyone. And you think that'll stop him? No, but it might slow him down, buy us time. She paused. And if we're going down anyway, we might as well make enough noise that other people he's hurt see they're not alone. Rowan stared at her like she'd grown a second head. You really believe that, don't you? That fighting back matters even when you can't win. I have to believe it, Leora said quietly. Otherwise, what's the point of any of this? He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the lamplight. Then he nodded once, sharp and final. Write your article, but make it honest. I won't have my family's name attached to lies. It'll all be true, she promised. Every word. She wrote the story that night, sitting at the kitchen table with a stub of pencil and pages torn from an old ledger. She wrote about a ranch struggling to survive, about a widower trying to provide for his daughter, about a community rallying around them. She wrote about Pritchard's tactics, the stolen cattle, the supplier boycotts, the bank manipulation. She made it personal and specific and impossible to ignore. Then she wrote about herself, about being a woman who'd arrived with nothing and found purpose in feeding people. She didn't mention Chicago or Vincent, some secrets had to stay buried, but she wrote about what it meant to build something from scratch against impossible odds. When she finished, the sun was coming up and her hand was cramping. But the story was solid, compelling, the kind of thing that would spread across the territory like wildfire if anyone bothered to print it. She sent it to Helena with the morning supply run, along with a note begging the journalist to run it immediately. Then she went back to rationing flour and praying that young Bill would return before they ran completely dry. He showed up 2 days later looking half dead but triumphant, leading a wagon loaded with supplies purchased from an Idaho merchant who'd never heard of Silas Pritchard and didn't care about Montana politics. "We're saved," he announced, barely able to stand. "For now," Dutch corrected, but he was smiling. They unloaded the wagon in record time, and Leora immediately started baking. They had orders to fill, customers to satisfy, money to make. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The article ran 3 days later. It was front-page news. The journalist had added details from his own investigation, interviews with other ranchers Pritchard had crushed, quotes from suppliers who admitted they'd been pressured to boycott Blackthorn Ranch, even a statement from a former bank employee about questionable foreclosure practices. The headline read, "Cattle Baron's War Against Widow Ranch Exposes Corruption Across Territory." The widow detail was wrong. Rowan wasn't a widow. He was a widower. But the journalist had apparently decided the story played better with a grieving woman at the center. Leora didn't correct it. Let people think what they wanted. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Letters poured in from across Montana and neighboring territories. Support. Outrage. Stories from other people who'd been crushed by Pritchard's machine. Orders for bread tripled overnight. People wanted to support the ranch that had dared to stand up. A coalition of small ranchers sent a letter pledging to testify against Pritchard if legal action was ever filed. 3 suppliers reached out offering to sell ingredients at cost, delivery included, because they were tired of being bullied. The territorial governor's office sent a formal inquiry to the bank about their foreclosure practices. And Pritchard, according to reports filtering back from town, was absolutely furious. "This is bad," Dutch said, reading the latest batch of letters. Making him angry was the goal. But this? He's not going to let this stand. "Good," Rowan said grimly. "Let him come. At least now everyone's watching." But Leora felt the familiar cold dread settling into her bones. She'd made powerful men angry before. Knew what happened when you embarrassed them publicly, when you turned their private cruelty into public scandal. They didn't just retaliate, they annihilated. She was right. Pritchard showed up at Blackthorn Ranch 5 days after the article ran, riding in with 10 armed men like he was leading a military operation. Leora was in the kitchen when Dutch burst through the door. "Boss needs you at the main house, now." She wiped flour from her hands and followed him across the yard where Rowan stood on the porch facing down Pritchard's small army. The cattle baron himself sat on a massive black horse, dressed in expensive riding clothes and radiating the kind of cold fury that preceded violence. "You must be proud of yourself," Pritchard said, his voice carrying across the yard. "Getting your name in the paper, playing the victim." "I didn't play anything," Rowan replied. "Just told the truth." "The truth." Pritchard laughed without humor. "The truth is you're a failed rancher who can't manage his own affairs. The truth is you've been defaulting on loans and making excuses for 2 years. The truth is you're using a woman's charity project to avoid facing reality. That woman's charity project is the only reason you don't own this land yet." Pritchard's gaze shifted, finding Leora in the crowd of gathering ranch hands. His eyes were cold and assessing in a way that made her skin crawl. "The famous baker. I offered you a very generous position. You should have taken it." "I don't work for thieves," Leora said before she could stop herself. The yard went silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. Pritchard smiled, and it was the most frightening thing Leora had seen since leaving Chicago. "Brave words. Let's see how brave you are when your little bakery burns down." Is that a threat? Rowan's voice was dangerous. It's a prediction. Pritchard gestured to his men. Fire's a terrible thing. So unpredictable, especially in old wooden structures filled with flour dust and grease. One spark could destroy everything. You'd burn down a kitchen? Dutch stepped forward, hand moving toward the gun at his hip. With women working in it? I wouldn't burn anything, but accidents happen. Pritchard's smile widened, especially when people don't understand that some fights can't be won. Here's what's going to happen, Cade. You're going to sell me this ranch for exactly what you owe the bank. Not a penny more. Your little baker is going to disappear back to whatever hole she crawled out of. And you're going to count yourself lucky that I'm being this generous after the embarrassment you've caused me. And if I refuse? Rowan asked quietly. Then I'll foreclose through the bank, evict you forcibly, and make sure every supplier, every customer, every business contact you have knows that supporting you means becoming my enemy. Pritchard leaned forward in his saddle. I've broken bigger men than you, Cade. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Leora watched Rowan's face and saw him calculating, saw him weighing the odds of fighting versus the cost of losing, saw the moment he almost gave in, almost accepted that some battles weren't worth the casualties. Then Elsie appeared on the porch. The little girl had been inside, probably hiding from the shouting. But now she stood there in her patched dress, eyes wide and terrified, looking between her father and the armed men in the yard. And she spoke. Papa? One word. The first word she'd spoken in public in 2 years. It fell into the silence like a stone into still water. Rowan's face transformed. All the calculation, all the defeat, burned away in an instant, replaced by something fierce and protective and absolutely unyielding. He turned back to Pritchard. Get off my land. You're making a mistake. Get off my land. Rowan's hand moved to his gun. Behind him, every ranch hand did the same. And if you or any of your men come back here, if anything happens to my kitchen or my family or anyone working for me, I'll put a bullet in you myself and let the territorial court sort it out. The yard crackled with tension. 10 armed men facing down 6 ranch hands and 1 desperate father. The odds were terrible, but sometimes odds didn't matter. Pritchard studied Rowan for a long moment. Then his gaze swept across the ranch hands, across Leora, finally landing on Elsie still standing on the porch. That's a sweet little girl, he said softly. Be a shame if something happened to her. The words hung in the air like poison. Rowan drew his gun. So did Dutch, Tomas, James, Charlie, and young Bill. 6 guns pointing at 10 men in the space of a heartbeat. Leave, Rowan said, his voice absolutely flat. While you still can. For a moment, Leora thought Pritchard would give the order to fire. Thought she was about to watch everyone she'd started to care about die in a Montana ranch yard because she'd convinced them to fight instead of surrender. Then Pritchard smiled again, that same cold, terrible smile. You can't protect everyone all the time, Cade, remember that. He turned his horse and rode out, his men following. But the threat lingered long after the sound of hoofbeats faded. Rowan didn't lower his gun until they were completely out of sight. Then he holstered it and turned to Elsie, who was crying silently on the porch. He climbed the steps and gathered her into his arms, holding her like she was made of glass. It's okay, baby, he murmured. Papa's got you. Nobody's going to hurt you. But over his daughter's head, his eyes found Leora's. And what she saw there was fear, because they'd won the confrontation. But Pritchard was right about one thing. They couldn't protect everyone all the time, and men like him always found the gaps. That night, Rowan stationed armed guards around the kitchen and main house in rotating shifts. Nobody slept well. Every creak of wood, every gust of wind, every distant sound had men reaching for weapons, and Leora jolting awake with her heart hammering. She kept the knife under her pillow now, instead of under the mattress. By dawn, exhaustion hung over the ranch like fog. But the buildings were still standing, and nobody had died. Small victories. Leora started the ovens early, needing the familiar rhythm of work to quiet the fear gnawing at her ribs. Her hands moved automatically, measuring flour, kneading dough, shaping loaves, while her mind circled the same question over and over: how long could they sustain this? Pritchard had infinite resources. They had determination and public sympathy. It wasn't a fair fight, but then nothing in her life had ever been fair. You're up early. She turned to find Rowan in the doorway, looking like he hadn't slept at all. His hair was disheveled, his eyes shadowed, and he held a coffee mug like it was the only thing keeping him upright. "Couldn't sleep," she said. "Me either." He crossed to the stove where coffee was already brewing and refilled his cup. Elsie had nightmares, 3 different times, but she talked through 2 of them, actually used words to tell me what scared her. Despite everything, Leora smiled. "That's progress." "Because of you." He stared into his coffee like it held answers. "She only started speaking again after you came. I should have said that before. Should have thanked you properly. You don't owe me thanks for being decent to a child." "Don't I?" His voice was rough. "I gave up on her. After Catherine died, I didn't know how to reach her. Didn't know how to be both parents. So I kept her fed and clothed and alive and told myself that was enough." He set down the cup. "But you showed up, and within a month she's speaking again, smiling, acting like a kid instead of a ghost." Leora's throat tightened. She was never a ghost. She was just scared. So was I. The admission seemed to cost him something. "Still am, if I'm honest. Pritchard threatening her yesterday." He stopped, jaw clenching. "If anything happens to Elsie because I was too stubborn to sell, I'll never forgive myself." "Nothing's going to happen to her." "You can't promise that." "No," Leora agreed. "But I can promise that we'll do everything possible to keep her safe, and that running doesn't guarantee safety either." He looked at her sharply. "You sound like you know that from experience." She did. She'd run from Vincent for 6 months, constantly looking over her shoulder, jumping at shadows, never sleeping more than a few hours at a time. Running hadn't made her safe. It had just made her tired and alone. But she wasn't ready to tell Rowan that story. Not yet. Maybe not ever. "I know that powerful men don't stop hunting you just because you disappear," she said carefully. "They stop when you make yourself too expensive to destroy, when the cost of crushing you exceeds the satisfaction they'd get from winning." "And how do we do that?" "We make this fight so public, so visible, that Pritchard can't win without destroying his own reputation." She pulled a tray of risen dough toward her and started shaping rolls. "He threatened to burn the kitchen. Fine. We make sure every newspaper in 3 territories knows he made that threat. We document everything, every intimidation, every dirty trick, every illegal move, and we make it clear that if anything happens to us, the whole world will know exactly who's responsible." Rowan watched her work, something shifting in his expression. "You've thought about this a lot." "I've had time." "Most people would have run by now, taken Pritchard's offer and disappeared." "I'm not most people." "No." His voice was soft. "You're really not." The moment stretched between them, heavy with things neither was ready to say. Then Elsie appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes, and the spell broke. "Papa?" Her voice was small and uncertain. "Is the bad man coming back?" Rowan crossed to her in 3 strides and lifted her into his arms. "No, baby. He's not coming back. I promise." "You said nobody could hurt me." "And I meant it." Elsie looked past her father to Leora. "Can I help make bread?" The question was so normal, so innocently childlike in the middle of all this chaos, that Leora felt her eyes sting. "Of course you can. Come wash your hands." They spent the morning baking together, Rowan eventually joining them after giving up on sleep entirely. It was strange and domestic, and felt dangerously close to something Leora had stopped letting herself want: family. But the illusion shattered when Dutch burst through the door just after noon. "We've got a problem," he announced. "Big one." They gathered in the main house. All the ranch hands, Leora, Rowan, even Anna, who'd shown up for her shift and gotten caught in the emergency meeting. Dutch spread a newspaper across the table. It was from Helena, dated that morning. The headline made Leora's blood run cold. Questions raised about Blackthorn Ranch Baker's past. The article was short and devastating. It didn't mention Vincent by name, but it painted a picture of a woman who'd arrived in Montana with no references, no verifiable employment history, and suspicious gaps in her story. It quoted anonymous sources suggesting she might be running from criminal charges. It questioned whether the territorial community should be supporting a ranch that employed someone with such a questionable background. Pritchard's fingerprints were all over it. "This is a smear campaign," young Bill said angrily. "Straight-up character assassination." "It's working," Tomas countered. "I was in town this morning. People are talking. Some of our customers are nervous about ordering from us now. Rowan's face was carved from stone. Is any of it true? The question hung in the air. Everyone looked at Leora. She felt Vincent's hands around her throat, felt the burn of his cigars on her skin, felt the weight of every secret she'd carried across 1,000 miles pressing down until she could barely breathe. Tell them, a voice whispered. They deserve to know. But telling meant risking everything, meant exposing herself, meant giving Pritchard ammunition that could destroy not just her, but everyone who'd stood beside her. I'm not running from criminal charges, she said carefully. I've never broken any law. But you are running from something, Rowan said. It wasn't a question. Yes. What? Someone. A man. The words felt like glass in her throat. A man who hurt me, who I escaped from, who I'm terrified will find me if my past becomes too public. The kitchen went very quiet. Dutch cleared his throat. This man, he's why you had no references? Why you took a job in the middle of nowhere? Yes. He's still looking for you? I don't know. Maybe. Probably. Men like Vincent didn't let their possessions just walk away. Rowan's expression was unreadable. What did he do to you? Does it matter? It matters to me. Leora looked at this man who'd given her shelter when she was desperate, who'd trusted her with his daughter and his failing ranch, who was now facing ruin partly because she'd convinced him to fight instead of surrender. He deserved the truth. But the truth was so ugly. He hurt me, she said quietly. For years. He made me believe I deserved it, that I was lucky he paid attention to me at all. And when I finally fought back, when I tried to leave, he made it clear he'd rather see me dead than free. She pulled up her sleeve, exposing the burn scars that crossed her left arm like railway tracks. Rowan's intake of breath was sharp. These are from cigars, she continued, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. He used them when he wanted to punish me for small mistakes, for burning bread or speaking without permission or looking at other men. And when I finally stabbed him with a kitchen knife and ran, I became a criminal in his eyes. Someone who'd stolen his property, because that's what I was to him. Property. The silence was absolute. Anna was crying quietly. Young Bill looked murderous. Dutch's weathered face had gone pale. Rowan stood and crossed to her slowly, like approaching something wild that might bolt. He took her scarred arm gently and studied the marks with an expression she couldn't read. What was his name? His voice was very soft, very dangerous. It doesn't matter. It does to me. Vincent Mercer, from Chicago. Chicago's a long way from Montana. Not far enough? Leora pulled her arm back and rolled down her sleeve. If Pritchard keeps digging, if my name gets printed in more newspapers, Vincent might see it. He has money and connections and an obsessive need to own things. If he finds out I'm here, then we'll deal with it, Rowan interrupted. Together. You don't understand. He's dangerous. So is Pritchard. So is every man who thinks power gives him the right to hurt people. Rowan's jaw was tight. The difference is we're not running anymore. Not from Pritchard. Not from your past. We stand our ground and we fight. And if this Vincent bastard shows up, we'll handle him too. You can't promise that. Watch me. Dutch stepped forward. Boss is right. You're one of us now. That means we protect you. Same as we'd protect any hand working this ranch. The other men nodded, murmuring agreement. Even Anna, tears still streaming down her face, managed a fierce nod. Leora felt something crack open in her chest, some frozen place she'd kept locked since fleeing Chicago. These people barely knew her, had every reason to throw her out to protect themselves. But they were choosing to stand with her anyway. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Thank you, she managed. Don't thank us yet, young Bill said grimly. We still need to figure out how to counter this smear campaign before it destroys our customer base. He was right. Emotional support didn't pay loan payments or buy supplies. They needed a strategy. We tell my story, Leora said. The real one. All of it. Rowan frowned. That's what Pritchard wants. To expose you, discredit you. He wants to control the narrative, make me look like a criminal or a con artist. She was thinking fast now, seeing the path forward. But what if we take that power away from him? What if I go public first, on my own terms, and frame it as survival instead of deception? That's risky, Dutch said. Everything we're doing is risky. Leora looked around the room at these people who'd become her unlikely family. But there's power in owning your story before someone else can weaponize it. Women across this territory have survived men like Vincent. If I speak openly about what I escaped from, some of them might recognize their own pain in mine, might support us because they understand. Or they might judge you, Anna said softly. Call you damaged goods, say you brought trouble on yourself. Maybe. Leora had heard those accusations before, whispered by women who blamed victims because it was safer than admitting they were all vulnerable. But maybe some will see the truth, that surviving doesn't make you damaged, it makes you strong. Rowan studied her for a long moment. You sure about this? Once it's public, you can't take it back. I'm sure. Then write it. Make it powerful. Make it honest. His voice softened. And make sure everyone knows that anyone who comes after you has to go through all of us first. She wrote the letter that afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table with shaking hands. She wrote about Vincent. Not his name at first, just what he'd done. The years of control and violence disguised as love. The burns and bruises hidden beneath long sleeves. The way he'd systematically destroyed her connection to anyone who might help her escape. The night she'd finally fought back and run. Then she wrote about the running itself. 6 months of fear and paranoia, sleeping in stables and rooming houses, working under false names at restaurants that didn't ask questions, the constant terror that he'd find her and drag her back. She wrote about arriving in Silver Creek with nothing but a carpet bag and desperation, about Rowan giving her a chance when she had no references and a past full of holes, about finding purpose in feeding exhausted ranch hands and slowly befriending a silent little girl who understood trauma without words. She wrote about building something meaningful from nothing, about learning that survival wasn't the same as living, about discovering that some fights were worth the risk of losing everything. And then, at the end, she did something Vincent would have killed her for. She named him. Vincent Mercer of Chicago tortured me for years and nearly destroyed me. But I escaped. I survived. I rebuilt my life in Montana, and I refuse to let powerful men, whether in Chicago or here, decide my future through intimidation and violence. My past doesn't define my worth. My scars don't make me weak, and I will not be silent anymore. She signed it simply, Leora Vale, Blackthorn Ranch. Then she sent it to every newspaper in 3 territories. The response was explosive. Within a week, the letter had been reprinted in dozens of papers. Some editors added supportive commentary. Others printed it without comment and let readers fight in letters to the editor. A few condemned her for speaking publicly about private matters. But the overwhelming response was support. Women wrote letters sharing their own stories of survival. Men wrote pledging to stand against violence toward women. Orders for bread tripled, then quadrupled. People wanted to support the ranch that employed a woman brave enough to speak her truth. A lawyer from Helena offered free legal services if Vincent ever tried to pursue her. 3 different boarding houses sent messages saying she'd always have a safe place if she needed to run again. The territorial governor gave a speech condemning domestic violence and promising increased legal protections for women escaping abusive situations. And Vincent Mercer's name became synonymous with brutality across the frontier. Pritchard's smear campaign had backfired spectacularly, but victory came with a price Leora hadn't fully considered. She'd made her past public, which meant Vincent now knew exactly where to find her. The letter arrived 3 weeks after her story went public. It was addressed to Leora Vale, Blackthorn Ranch, Montana Territory, in handwriting she recognized immediately. Her hand shook so badly she nearly dropped it. Rowan found her standing in the kitchen, staring at the unopened envelope like it was a snake. What's wrong? She couldn't speak, just handed him the letter. He looked at the return address and his face went hard. Chicago? She nodded. You want me to open it? Part of her wanted to throw it in the stove unread, burn it and pretend Vincent didn't exist. But hiding from monsters didn't make them disappear. It just gave them power. No, she whispered. I need to do it. She opened the envelope with fingers that felt numb and pulled out a single sheet of expensive paper covered in Vincent's precise handwriting. My dearest Leora, it began, and her stomach turned at the possessive endearment. I was most distressed to read about your unfortunate experiences in Montana. The frontier is no place for a woman of your delicate constitution. particularly one suffering from such obvious mental distress. Your fanciful tales about our relationship in Chicago deeply concern me. Such elaborate delusions often indicate serious illness. As your former employer and friend, I feel obligated to travel to Montana and provide proper testimony regarding your unstable mental state. I'm certain the authorities there will be most interested to learn the truth about your departure from Chicago, including the violent assault you perpetrated against me before fleeing with several valuable items from my household. I depart Chicago next week and should arrive in Montana by month's end. I look forward to our reunion and to ensuring you receive the care you so desperately need. With deepest affection and concern, Vincent Mercer. The letter fell from her hands. It was masterfully done. He'd positioned himself as the concerned former employer, her as the delusional, unstable woman who'd attacked him and stolen from him. If he showed up with lawyers and doctors and that practiced concerned expression, he could make her look insane, could have her committed to an asylum where he'd have complete control again. And Montana law would likely support him, a wealthy Chicago businessman versus a woman with documented trauma and admittedly no proof of her claims beyond scars that could have come from anywhere. "Let me see it," Rowan said. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Vincent was coming. After 6 months of running, of building a new life, of finally feeling safe, he was coming. Rowan read the letter, his expression growing progressively darker. When he finished, he folded it carefully and set it on the table. "He's not taking you," he said quietly. "You can't stop him. If he shows up with legal documents claiming I'm mentally unfit, claiming I stole from him, then we'll fight it in court. With what money? What lawyers?" Her voice was rising, panic bleeding through. "He has everything. Money, connections, the law on his side. Men like him always win. Not this time." "You don't know that." "I know that you're not alone anymore." Rowan's voice was steady, certain. "You're part of this ranch, part of this family, and we don't abandon family. This isn't your fight." "Like hell it isn't." He crossed to her and gripped her shoulders, forcing her to meet his eyes. "You stood with me when Pritchard came. Convinced me to fight instead of surrender. Risked everything to save this ranch. You think I'm going to let some Chicago bastard drag you back to hell after everything you've done for us? He'll destroy you, you and Elsie and everyone here. He can try." Rowan's jaw was set in that stubborn line she'd come to recognize. "But he'll have to go through every person on this ranch first. And Lyora? We're a lot tougher than we look." She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that love and loyalty could somehow triumph over money and power and a legal system designed to favor men like Vincent. But she'd learned the hard way that wanting something didn't make it true. That night, she couldn't sleep. She kept imagining Vincent's arrival, kept seeing him walk into the ranch with his cold smile and his lawyers and his complete certainty that he'd already won, kept feeling his hands around her throat and his voice in her ear telling her she'd never escape him. Around midnight, she gave up on sleep and went downstairs to the kitchen. Maybe working would quiet her mind, but Elsie was there, sitting at the table in her nightgown. "Honey, what are you doing up?" Leora asked. The little girl looked at her with those two old eyes. "You're scared." It wasn't a question. Leora sat down across from her, too tired to lie. "Yes. Of the bad man from Chicago. You heard about that?" "I hear things." Elsie picked at the tablecloth. "Papa thinks I don't understand, but I do. A mean man hurt you. Now he's coming here." Leora's throat tightened. "I'm sorry. I never meant to bring danger to your home." "It's your home too," Elsie said simply. "Papa said so. He said you're family now." "Did he?" The child nodded seriously. "When you first came, I was scared of you. You had sad eyes like Mama had before she died, but then you weren't scared of my screaming. You just held me and made it better." She reached across the table and took Leora's scarred hand. "The bad man made these?" "Yes. Papa says strong people aren't the ones who don't get hurt. They're the ones who get hurt and keep going anyway." Elsie's grip tightened. "You kept going. That means you're strong, stronger than the bad man." Leora felt tears sliding down her face. This child, this brave, damaged, healing child, was trying to comfort her. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't let him take you away. Elsie said fiercely. I just got you. I need you to stay. I'll try. Promise. Leora looked at this little girl who'd lost her mother and found her voice again through sheer determination to survive her own trauma. Who was looking at Leora like she was someone worth fighting for? I promise, she said. I'll fight to stay. Elsie smiled, a real smile, bright and hopeful and absolutely trusting. And Leora realized that running wasn't an option anymore. Not because she couldn't, but because she had people depending on her now. A child who needed her, a man who'd stood beside her, a community that had rallied when she needed support. She'd spent 6 months running from Vincent. Maybe it was time to stand and fight instead. The next morning, she called a meeting. Everyone gathered in the main house, all the ranch hands, Anna, even Margaret from town, who'd heard about the letter and ridden out to help. Leora stood at the head of the table and looked at these people who'd become her unlikely army. Vincent Mercer is coming, she said without preamble. He'll be here within 2 weeks. He's going to try to have me declared mentally unfit and drag me back to Chicago. And if that doesn't work, he'll probably just try to kill me and make it look like an accident. Then we don't let him get close to you, Dutch said immediately. It's not that simple. He'll have lawyers, possibly law enforcement. He'll make everything look legitimate and legal, and fighting him will make us look like the criminals. So what do we do? Young Bill asked. Leora took a breath. We prepare. We document everything, every scar, every witness who knew me in Chicago, every piece of evidence that proves what he did. We hire the best lawyer we can afford, maybe that one from Helena who offered to help. We make sure that if this goes to court, we have a case strong enough that money can't bury the truth. That'll be expensive, Tomas pointed out. I know, which is why we need to increase bread production again. Work every angle, make as much money as possible before he arrives. She looked around the table. I know I'm asking a lot, asking you to risk your safety and your livelihoods for someone who's only been here a few months. And I'll understand if any of you want to leave before this gets uglier. Nobody moved. You're not just someone who's been here a few months, Margaret said firmly. You're the woman who saved this ranch, who stood up to Pritchard when everyone said it was impossible, who treats damaged kids with kindness and bakes bread that makes grown men weep. That's not nothing, Leora. She's right, Anna added. My mother's still scared, still thinks we should stay away, but I watched you face down Pritchard's man and refuse his threats, watched you turn your trauma into strength. I'm not walking away from that. None of us are, Rowan said quietly. His eyes met hers across the table. We're with you. All the way. The weight of their loyalty was almost crushing. These people barely knew her, but they were willing to stand between her and a monster because she'd stood with them first. Thank you, she managed. All of you. So what's the plan? Dutch asked. Leora outlined it piece by piece. They'd hire the Helena lawyer immediately, document her scars with photographs and medical examination, track down anyone who'd witnessed Vincent's abuse in Chicago, kitchen staff from the restaurant, neighbors from her building, anyone who might testify. Build an irrefutable case that she was the victim, not the criminal. Simultaneously, they'd fortify the ranch against whatever Vincent might attempt. Postcards. Never leave Leora alone. Keep weapons accessible. Make it clear that any attempt to take her by force would end badly. And they'd go public again. Write to newspapers explaining that an abusive Chicago businessman was attempting to recapture the woman he'd tortured. Turn Vincent's arrival into a public spectacle that he couldn't easily manipulate. It was an ambitious plan, probably impossible, but impossible was becoming their specialty. They worked around the clock for the next 2 weeks. The Helena lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Dawson, arrived and began building their case with ruthless efficiency. She took photographs of Leora's scars, recorded her testimony in excruciating detail, and sent telegrams to Chicago requesting employment records and medical documentation. Meanwhile, bread production hit record levels. They were baking 100 loaves a day now, running delivery routes to 15 towns, employing 5 women full-time. The money poured in, enough to pay Patricia's fees and make the ranch's loan payment early. Pritchard had gone quiet since the public sympathy turned against him, but Leora knew he was watching, waiting. Men like him didn't give up. They just recalculated their approach. Rowan barely left her side. He was always there, walking her between the kitchen and main house, sitting in the corner while she worked, standing watch while she slept. It should have felt suffocating, but instead it felt like safety. Late one night, when the bread was cooling and everyone else had gone to bed, they sat together on the kitchen steps watching the stars. "Can I ask you something?" Rowan said quietly. "Always." "Why didn't you tell me about Vincent when you first arrived?" Leora was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "Because telling meant risking everything. You were already drowning. Adding my baggage seemed cruel. And now? Now I've already dragged you into my mess, whether I wanted to or not." She smiled without humor. "Might as well be honest about it." "I'm glad you told me." He was looking at the stars, not at her. "Not because it changed anything about how I see you, but because carrying that alone must have been hell." It was. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning that went beyond Vincent and survival and strategic planning. Leora felt her heart do something complicated in her chest. "Rowan." "I know." He finally looked at her, and his expression was complicated. "I know the timing's terrible. I know we're in the middle of fighting two different battles and barely surviving. I know I've got a daughter who needs stability, and a ranch that's barely solvent, and a past that's almost as messy as yours." "Then what are you saying?" "I'm saying that somewhere between you holding my screaming daughter and convincing me to fight Pritchard and standing up to your own demons, I stopped seeing you as hired help." His voice was rough. "And I need you to know that, before Vincent gets here and everything goes to hell. I need you to know that you matter. To me, to Elsie, to all of us." Leora couldn't breathe, couldn't think. 6 months ago, she'd been running for her life with nothing but fear and determination. Now she was sitting on a kitchen step with a man who'd just said she mattered, and the weight of it was almost unbearable. "I matter to you," she repeated slowly. "Yes. Even though I'm damaged, even though my past is following me here and threatening everything you've built?" "You're not damaged." His voice was fierce. "You're surviving. There's a difference." She laughed, but it came out broken. "You say that now. Wait until Vincent shows up and you see what I came from. See how weak I was for so long." "You weren't weak. You were trapped." Rowan shifted closer. "And Leora? The fact that you escaped, that you rebuilt yourself, that you're sitting here ready to fight instead of run? That's not weakness. That's the strongest thing I've ever seen." She felt tears sliding down her face and didn't bother to hide them. "I'm terrified he's going to win. That all of this, the ranch, the bakery, you and Elsie, that I'm going to lose all of it because I wasn't strong enough to stay hidden." "Then we make sure he doesn't win." Rowan took her hand, the scarred one she usually kept hidden, and held it gently. "Together." The words settled over her like a blanket. Together. Not alone. Not running. Not hiding. Together. "Okay," she whispered. "Together." They sat there until dawn, hands clasped, watching the stars fade and the sun rise over the Montana wilderness. And when the telegraph arrived 2 days later announcing Vincent Mercer's arrival in Helena, Leora was ready, or at least as ready as she'd ever be. Vincent arrived on a Tuesday afternoon with 3 hired men, 2 lawyers, and the confidence of someone who'd never lost a fight that mattered. Leora watched from the kitchen window as the carriage pulled into the ranch yard, her hands gripping the counter so hard her knuckles went white. She'd spent 6 months imagining this moment, Vincent finding her, confronting her, dragging her back into the nightmare she'd escaped. But imagination was nothing compared to the reality of seeing him step out of that carriage in his expensive suit, scanning the ranch like he was assessing property he already owned. He looked exactly the same. Handsome in that polished, calculated way, dark hair perfectly styled, clean-shaven, smile that never reached his cold eyes. The kind of man mothers pointed out to their daughters as a good catch, completely blind to the monster underneath the charm. "Leora," Rowan's voice was steady behind her. "You don't have to see him. We can handle this." "No." She forced herself to breathe. "I need to face him. If I hide, he wins." Rowan moved to stand beside her, and she felt his hand rest briefly on her shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that steadied her more than words could. Through the window, she saw Dutch and the other hands emerging from the barn, positioning themselves strategically around the yard. Not threatening, but present, watchful. Vincent noticed them, and his smile widened, like he found their protective stance amusing. Let's get this over with, Leora said. They walked out together. Rowan, Leora, and Patricia Dawson, who'd been waiting in the main house for exactly this moment. Vincent's gaze locked on Leora immediately, and she saw something flicker across his face. Surprise, maybe, that she looked healthy instead of broken, that she stood straight instead of cowering. Leora, her name in his mouth made her skin crawl. You look well. Montana Air must agree with you. Mr. Mercer, she kept her voice level. You weren't invited here. No? He gestured to one of his lawyers, who produced papers from a leather case. I have a legal writ requesting custody evaluation. Given your documented mental instability and history of violent behavior, the court in Chicago has granted me authority to ensure you receive proper care. Patricia stepped forward. Those papers have no legal standing in Montana territory. You'll need to petition a local court if you want any action taken, and I assure you, we'll fight it. Vincent's gaze shifted to Patricia, assessing and dismissing her in the same glance. And you are? Patricia Dawson, attorney at law. I represent Miss Vale and Blackthorn Ranch. How progressive. His tone dripped condescension. A woman lawyer defending a delusional woman baker. I'm sure that will go well in court. Better than you think, Patricia replied coolly. Montana Territory has been surprisingly receptive to women's testimony, particularly when the evidence is as compelling as what we've gathered. Something dangerous flashed in Vincent's eyes. Evidence? Of what exactly? Of systematic torture and abuse spanning 3 years. Patricia's voice was crisp, professional. Medical documentation of burn scars, fractures that healed improperly, testimony from witnesses who saw Miss Vale's condition while under your employment. Would you like me to continue? Vincent laughed, that practiced, dismissive sound Leora remembered from every time she'd tried to argue or defend herself. Those scars came from kitchen accidents. Leora was always clumsy, weren't you, dear? And the witnesses you've allegedly found were paid well to lie, I'm certain. No, Leora said quietly. They were paid to stay silent. There's a difference. His attention snapped back to her, and for just a second, the mask slipped. She saw rage in his eyes, pure cold fury that she dared speak back to him, that she wasn't already cowering and apologizing and begging him to take her back. Leora. His voice shifted, became gentle, concerned. The tone he'd use in public when he wanted everyone to see how patient he was with his difficult, unstable employee. I understand you're confused, frightened, but these people are using you, exploiting your trauma for their own gain. I'm here to help you, to bring you home where you can receive proper treatment. I'm not going anywhere with you. You don't have a choice. The courts will hear testimony from multiple witnesses, Patricia interrupted. They'll see photographic evidence of injuries inconsistent with kitchen accidents. They'll review employment records showing you paid Miss Vale barely enough to survive while requiring her to live in your household. And they'll hear about the restraining order currently being filed against you, which prohibits contact with Miss Vale pending a full investigation into allegations of assault, kidnapping, and human trafficking. The yard went very quiet. Vincent stared at Patricia like she'd sprouted a second head. Human trafficking? That's absurd. Leora worked for me voluntarily. Did she? Patricia pulled out a folder. Because according to records we've obtained, you paid for her father's funeral expenses, then required her to work off that debt at wages well below market rate. You prevented her from seeking other employment by threatening to report the debt to authorities. You controlled where she lived, who she spoke to, where she went. That fits the legal definition of debt bondage, Mr. Mercer, which is a federal crime. Leora watched Vincent's face cycle through emotions. Shock, rage, calculation. She'd never seen him cornered before. Had never imagined it was possible to back him into a corner. You're making a serious mistake, he said quietly. All of you. I have resources you can't imagine, connections that reach across this entire country. I can destroy this pathetic little ranch, this woman's ridiculous legal career, and every person standing in this yard. And I'll do it slowly, painfully, until you're all begging me to stop. No, Rowan said. His voice was conversational, almost pleasant, which somehow made it more frightening. You won't. Vincent turned to look at him properly for the first time. And who exactly are you? Rowan Cade. I own this ranch, and Leora works for me now, which means you threatening her is the same as threatening my employee, my business, and my family. I don't take kindly to that." "Family?" Vincent's laugh was ugly. "You've been screwing her, haven't you? Is that what this is? Some frontier romance where the broken woman finds salvation in a cowboy's arms?" Rowan's expression didn't change, but Lyora felt the violence coiled in him, felt how close he was to crossing the yard and putting his fist through Vincent's face. "What happens between Miss Vale and myself is none of your concern," Rowan said evenly. "But I'll tell you what is your concern. Those men standing behind you, they're hired muscle. The men standing behind me are family, loyal, armed, and very protective. If you try to take Lyora by force, if you threaten anyone on this property, if you so much as look at her wrong, things will get very ugly very quickly. Do you understand?" For the first time since arriving, Vincent looked uncertain. His gaze swept across the ranch hands. Dutch, with his hand resting on his gun, young Bill looking like he desperately wanted an excuse to fight, Tomas and the others forming a silent wall of opposition. "This isn't over," Vincent said finally. "I'll petition the courts. I'll bring in federal marshals if necessary. And when I prove that Lyora is mentally unfit and that you people have been harboring a fugitive—" "She's not a fugitive," Patricia interrupted. "She's a victim who escaped her abuser and has committed no crime. But you, Mr. Mercer, are currently in violation of multiple territorial laws regarding threats and intimidation. I suggest you leave. Now, before I have the sheriff escort you off this property." Vincent's jaw clenched. For a moment, Lyora thought he might actually order his men to attack, might force the confrontation into violence right here in the ranch yard. Then Elsie appeared on the main house porch. The little girl stood there in her patched dress, watching the scene with those two knowing eyes. And when she saw Vincent staring at her, she walked calmly down the steps and across the yard until she reached Lyora. She took Leora's hand and held it tight, glaring at Vincent with a child's uncomplicated hatred. "This is my mama," Elsie said clearly. "You can't have her." Something broke in Lyora's chest. Elsie had never called her that before, had never claimed her so publicly, so fiercely. Vincent looked at the child, at Lyora, at the wall of people standing between him and what he considered his property, and whatever calculation he was running, he apparently decided this wasn't the battlefield to choose. "We'll continue this in court," he said coldly. "Enjoy your temporary freedom, Lyora. It won't last." He climbed back into the carriage with his lawyers and hired men, and they rolled away, leaving nothing but dust and lingering tension. The moment they were out of sight, Lyora's legs gave out. Rowan caught her before she hit the ground, holding her while she shook with reaction and relief and terror that wasn't finished just because Vincent had left. Elsie pressed against her side, small arms wrapped tight, and Lyora realized she was crying. "You did it," Patricia said quietly. "You stood up to him. You didn't break." But Lyora didn't feel victorious. She felt exhausted and scared because Vincent was right about one thing. This wasn't over. He'd go to the courts, use his money and connections to twist the narrative, make himself the victim and her the criminal. "What happens now?" she asked when she could speak. "Now we prepare for court," Patricia said. "He'll file his petition within the week. We'll have maybe 2 weeks to build our counter case before a hearing." "Can we win?" "Honestly, I don't know." Patricia's brutal honesty was somehow more comforting than false reassurance. "He has money and influence, but we have truth and public opinion. It'll come down to which the judge values more." Over the next 2 weeks, they worked like people possessed. Patricia gathered every shred of evidence: medical records, witness statements from Chicago servants who'd seen Lyora's injuries, employment documents showing Vincent's control over her life. She tracked down a doctor who'd treated Lyora once for a broken rib and remembered Vincent claiming she'd fallen downstairs. Meanwhile, the newspapers ran wild with the story. "Chicago businessman pursues escaped victim to Montana," read one headline. "Abuser attempts legal kidnapping under guise of mental health concern," read another. Public opinion swung heavily in Lyora's favor, with editorials condemning Vincent and praising her courage. But Vincent wasn't idle either. He filed his petition claiming Lyora was mentally unstable and dangerous. Produced testimony from Chicago doctors he'd paid who claimed she showed signs of hysteria and delusion. Argued that she'd stolen valuable items when she fled and that criminal charges were pending. The hearing was set for March 15th in Helena. The judge was a territorial appointee named Harrison Webb, known for being fair but traditional in his views about women's capabilities and rights. He's not automatically hostile, Patricia warned during a strategy meeting the night before the hearing, but he's old-fashioned. He'll need to be convinced that you're credible and rational, not just sympathetic. How do I do that? Leora asked. By telling the truth, calmly, completely, without emotion that he can interpret as hysteria. Patricia's expression was grim. I know it's not fair. I know you should be able to show anger and pain and everything you've survived. But the reality is that women in court are judged differently. We have to play the game. Leora nodded. She'd been playing games her whole life, pretending Vincent's abuse was normal, hiding her injuries, smiling through pain. One more performance shouldn't be that hard. But this time, everything depended on her getting it right. The courtroom in Helena was packed. Leora had expected a quiet legal proceeding, but apparently the territory had decided this was entertainment worth witnessing. Every seat was filled, people stood along the walls, and the balcony held overflow spectators craning to see. Vincent sat at the plaintiff's table with his expensive lawyers, looking confident and righteous. He'd positioned himself perfectly, concerned former employer trying to help a delusional woman who'd lashed out at him violently. Leora sat beside Patricia, Rowan directly behind her in the gallery. She could feel his presence like an anchor, steady and solid. Judge Webb entered, and the room fell silent. He was older, maybe 60, with gray hair and a face carved by years of frontier justice. His eyes swept the courtroom, taking in the crowd, the lawyers, the two people at the center of this circus. This court is called to order, he announced. We're here to consider a petition from Vincent Mercer of Chicago requesting custody and mental health evaluation of Miss Leora Vale. Mr. Mercer, your opening statement. Vincent's lawyer stood, a polished man named Garrison, who spoke with practiced authority about poor Leora's tragic decline into mental instability, about how Vincent had employed her charitably despite her difficulties, about the violent attack she'd perpetrated when her delusions convinced her he was a threat, about his client's noble desire to ensure she received treatment rather than prosecuting her for theft and assault. It was masterfully done. By the time Garrison sat down, half the courtroom was looking at Leora with pity. Patricia's opening was different. Blunt, direct. She laid out the evidence of systematic abuse. The burns, the broken bones, the witnesses, the employment records showing debt bondage. She framed it not as mental illness, but as survival. Not as delusion, but as desperate escape from a monster who'd hidden his cruelty behind wealth and respectability. Your Honor, Patricia concluded, this case is simple. A powerful man tortured a vulnerable woman for years. She finally escaped. Now he wants to recapture her under the guise of concern. The question isn't whether Miss Vale is mentally fit. It's whether this court will protect an abuse victim or enable her abuser. The courtroom buzzed with reaction. Judge Webb banged his gavel for silence. We'll hear testimony, he said. Mr. Garrison, call your first witness. Vincent took the stand and performed beautifully. He was concerned, patient, slightly wounded that anyone would believe these terrible accusations. He spoke about Leora's clumsiness, her tendency toward dramatic stories, the theft of his property when she fled. He produced the doctors who claimed she showed signs of mental instability. Watching him, Leora felt the old fear creeping back. He was so convincing, so reasonable. How could anyone not believe him? Then Patricia cross-examined. Mr. Mercer, you claim Miss Vale was clumsy. How many kitchen accidents did she have during her employment? I didn't keep exact count. More than 10, 20, perhaps 15 or so over 3 years. 15 accidents severe enough to cause burns like these? Patricia held up photographs of Leora's scars. That seems unusual for someone you also claim was an excellent baker. Vincent's smile tightened. She was talented but careless. Yet you kept employing her despite these constant accidents? I felt charitable obligation. Or perhaps the accidents weren't accidents at all. Patricia pulled out another document. I have testimony from your former housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, who states she personally witnessed you burning Miss Vale with a cigar after she overcooked your dinner. Would you like to respond to that? Mrs. Chen is mistaken, or lying for money. I see. And the cook who saw you break Miss Vale's arm by twisting it behind her back? Also lying? Yes. And the neighbor who heard screaming from your kitchen on multiple occasions? Also lying? I run a busy household. Kitchens are noisy. And the doctor who treated Miss Vale for a broken rib and noted in his records that her story about falling downstairs didn't match the injury pattern? Vincent's composure finally cracked. I don't know what kind of conspiracy you've orchestrated, but these allegations are ridiculous. Are they? Patricia's voice was ice. Or is it ridiculous that you expect this court to believe that multiple independent witnesses, a doctor's medical records, and photographic evidence of injuries are all part of some elaborate delusion by one supposedly mentally ill woman? She tore him apart methodically, exposing every inconsistency, every convenient excuse, every time his story didn't quite match the evidence. By the time she finished, Vincent was sweating and angry, the mask of concern completely gone. Then it was Leora's turn to testify. She walked to the stand on shaking legs, feeling every eye in the courtroom on her. This was it, the moment everything hung on. Patricia led her through the story gently. How Vincent had hired her after her father died, how the debt had trapped her, how the abuse had started small, criticisms, impossible standards, then escalated to physical violence, how she'd finally snapped and fought back. Why didn't you report him to authorities? Patricia asked. Because he owned the authorities, Leora said quietly. He had dinner with judges and police chiefs. He donated to politicians. Who would believe a kitchen worker over him? What made you finally decide to run? Leora closed her eyes, remembering that night. The cigar burn that went too deep. Vincent's hands around her throat. The knife she'd grabbed in pure animal desperation. He told me I'd never escape, she said. That I belonged to him forever. That even death wouldn't free me because he'd hunt me in the afterlife. She opened her eyes and looked directly at Vincent. And I realized that believing him meant accepting I'd never be human again. Just his thing, his property. So I chose to believe I could survive instead. The courtroom was absolutely silent. And when you stabbed him? Patricia asked. I was trying to get away. He was choking me. I grabbed the nearest thing, a kitchen knife, and drove it into his shoulder. Then I ran while he was screaming, and I kept running for 6 months until I found Blackthorn Ranch. Do you regret it? Leora thought about that question, about whether she regretted the violence, the escape, the chaotic path that had brought her here. I regret that it was necessary, she said finally. I regret that he hurt me so badly that stabbing him was the only option I could see. But I don't regret surviving, and I don't regret building a life here that's mine, not his. Patricia nodded. No further questions. Garrison stood for cross-examination, trying to paint her as dramatic, emotional, unreliable. But Leora had spent 3 years walking the knife edge of Vincent's moods, learning to stay calm under pressure. She answered his questions steadily, refusing to be baited into anger or tears. The hearing stretched into a second day. More witnesses testified, ranch hands describing Leora's character, Anna talking about watching her stand up to Pritchard, even Dutch giving a gruff speech about how she'd saved the ranch through nothing but hard work and courage. Rowan testified too, describing how she'd arrived broken and built herself into someone strong, how she'd transformed his failing ranch, how his daughter spoke again after years of silence because Leora understood trauma without judgment. Do you have any concerns about Miss Vale's mental stability? Garrison asked during cross-examination. None, Rowan said flatly. She's the sanest person I know. Yet she stabbed a man. Oh. She defended herself from someone trying to kill her. That's not insanity. That's survival. Rowan leaned forward. You want to talk about mental stability? Let's talk about a man who tortures women for fun, who travels 1,000 miles to recapture someone who escaped him, who uses the legal system to hunt down victims. That sounds a lot more unstable to me. The courtroom erupted in applause. Judge Webb banged his gavel, but didn't look displeased. Finally, closing arguments. Garrison made a passionate speech about the importance of mental health treatment and the tragedy of letting delusional people roam free. Patricia countered with evidence and emotion, painting a picture of systematic abuse and corporate evil hiding behind respectability. Your Honor, she concluded, if you grant this petition, you're not sending a mentally ill woman to treatment. You're handing a torture victim back to her torturer. And every woman in this territory will learn that speaking up about abuse means losing everything, while abusers face no consequences at all. Is that the precedent you want to set? Judge Webb called for a recess to consider his ruling. The wait was agony. Leora sat in the hallway with Rowan beside her, holding her hand while Patricia paced and Vincent glared from across the room. After 2 hours, they were called back. Judge Webb looked tired as he surveyed the courtroom. "I've presided over many cases," he said slowly. "Cattle disputes, land conflicts, criminal matters. But this case has been uniquely difficult because it requires determining truth when two people tell very different stories." Leora's heart was hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. "Mr. Mercer presents himself as a concerned employer, Miss Vale as a survivor of abuse. The evidence could be interpreted either way, scars as accidents or torture, her flight as escape or theft, his pursuit as care or control." Webb paused. "But there's one piece of evidence that clarifies everything for me." He gestured to his clerk, who produced a document. "Yesterday evening, I received testimony from a federal investigator who's been building a case against Mr. Mercer for the past 8 months. The investigation began when another woman, a former employee, came forward with allegations remarkably similar to Miss Vale's. When investigators looked deeper, they found a pattern. 4 women over 6 years, all employed in his household, all showing signs of abuse, all paid barely enough to survive." Webb's voice hardened. "Mr. Mercer, you're not here because you're concerned about Miss Vale's mental health. You're here because she escaped and you can't tolerate losing control." Vincent was on his feet. "That's absurd." "Sit down." Webb's tone allowed no argument. "Based on the evidence presented, the testimony heard, and this federal investigation, I'm denying your petition in full. Miss Vale is under no obligation to submit to mental health evaluation, custody, or any contact with you whatsoever. Furthermore, I'm granting a permanent restraining order prohibiting you from approaching her, contacting her, or coming within 100 yards of Blackthorn Ranch." The courtroom exploded. Leora couldn't breathe, couldn't process what she was hearing. She'd won. She'd actually won. "Additionally," Webb continued over the noise, "I'm ordering that transcripts of this hearing be forwarded to federal authorities to aid in their investigation. Mr. Mercer, you're free to leave Montana, but I suspect you'll be answering questions in Chicago very soon." Vincent's face was purple with rage. "This is a travesty." "This is justice," Webb interrupted. "Perhaps the first real justice any of your victims have received." Court dismissed. He banged the gavel, and it was over. Leora sat frozen while chaos erupted around her. Patricia was hugging her. Rowan had his arms around both of them. People were cheering. Vincent was being escorted out by marshals, still screaming about appeals and corruption. She'd won. She was free. Actually, truly free. The realization hit like a wave and she started crying, huge gasping sobs that she couldn't control. Years of terror and pain and running poured out of her while Rowan held her and whispered that it was over, she was safe, nobody could hurt her anymore. And for the first time since her father died and Vincent had taken ownership of her life, Leora believed it. The ride back to Blackthorn Ranch took all day, but it felt like floating. Leora sat in the wagon beside Rowan, watching Montana wilderness roll past, and felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Hope, maybe. Or possibility. The sense that her future was hers to shape instead of something that would be done to her. "What are you thinking about?" Rowan asked. "Everything? Nothing?" She smiled. "I'm thinking that 3 months ago I stepped off a train expecting to hide until Vincent found me, and instead I found this. A failing ranch and a half-feral child? A family," she corrected. "People who stood beside me when they had every reason to run, who fought for me when I couldn't fight for myself." Rowan was quiet for a moment. "You fought plenty. Don't sell yourself short." "We fought together," she amended. "That's what made the difference." When they reached the ranch, the hands had organized a celebration. Tables set up in the yard, food cooked by Anna and Margaret, who'd ridden out specifically for the occasion, lanterns strung between buildings casting warm light over everything. Elsie ran to meet them, throwing herself into Leora's arms. "You came back!" "Of course I came back." Leora held her tight. "This is home." The word settled over her like truth. Home. Not a hiding place or a temporary refuge. Home. They celebrated late into the night, eating and drinking and sharing stories about the trial. Dutch gave a dramatic reenactulation of Patricia's cross-examination that had everyone laughing. Young Bill proposed a toast to the toughest woman in Montana. Even Margaret got misty-eyed, talking about how proud she was. Eventually, people drifted off to bed until it was just Leora and Rowan sitting on the kitchen steps under the stars. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. "I don't know," Leora admitted. "Vincent's gone. The court case is finished. I'm free to do whatever I want." "And what do you want?" It was a dangerous question. 3 months ago, all she'd wanted was to survive, to hide, to make it through one more day without being found. But somewhere between baking bread and comforting nightmares and standing up to cattle barons, her wants had changed. "I want to stay," she said. "If you'll have me. I want to keep running the bakery, keep being part of Elsie's life, keep building something that matters." "Just the bakery?" Rowan's voice was careful. Leora turned to look at him. This man who'd given her shelter and purpose and shown her what it meant to stand beside someone instead of controlling them. Who'd defended her against her past and fought for her future. Who looked at her scars and saw strength instead of damage. "No," she said quietly, "not just the bakery." He kissed her then, gentle and careful, like she was something precious instead of something broken. And Leora kissed him back, tasting possibility and promise, and the strange, terrifying joy of choosing love instead of having it forced upon her. When they finally pulled apart, he rested his forehead against hers. "Stay," he whispered. "Please. Elsie needs you. The ranch needs you. I need you." "I'm staying," she promised. "I'm done running." The months that followed were both harder and easier than Leora expected. The bakery exploded in popularity after the trial. Everyone wanted bread from the woman who'd stood up to her abuser and won. Orders poured in from across 3 territories. They had to hire 6 more women and expand the kitchen just to keep up with demand. The money rolled in, enough to pay off the ranch's debts entirely and invest in rebuilding the cattle herd. Pritchard made a few more attempts at sabotage, but public opinion had turned so thoroughly against him that his own business partners started distancing themselves. Within a year, he'd sold most of his Montana holdings and retreated to Wyoming, defeated by the same public scrutiny he'd tried to weaponize against others. Rowan rebuilt Blackthorn Ranch into something sustainable, not through cattle alone, but through diversification. The bakery, dairy production, a small trading post that served surrounding ranches. He learned to ask for help instead of drowning in pride, and the ranch flourished. Elsie blossomed. She started school in Silver Creek, made friends, laughed more than she cried. She still had nightmares sometimes, still grieved her mother in quiet moments. But she also had Leora, who understood that healing wasn't linear and love didn't require perfection. And Leora discovered something she'd never known before. That building a life was harder than running from one, but infinitely more satisfying. She and Rowan married in the spring, a simple ceremony in the ranch yard with everyone who'd stood beside them during the fight. Elsie served as flower girl, beaming with pride. Dutch gave Leora away since her father was gone and nobody else had earned the right. But the marriage wasn't a fairy tale ending where everything became perfect. They fought sometimes, about money, about the ranch, about how to raise Elsie. Rowan could be stubborn and closed off when he was hurting. Leora sometimes retreated into herself when stress mounted, old survival instincts kicking in. But they learned to fight fair, to apologize, to recognize that loving someone meant seeing their damage and choosing them anyway. Vincent was arrested in Chicago 6 months after the trial. The federal investigation uncovered enough evidence to charge him with multiple counts of assault, false imprisonment, and trafficking. His trial became national news, not because of Leora, but because 2 more women came forward, emboldened by her courage. He was sentenced to 23 years in federal prison. Leora didn't attend the trial, didn't need to watch him finally face consequences. She was too busy building bread recipes and teaching young women to bake and raising a daughter who called her mama without hesitation. Sometimes, late at night when everyone was asleep, she'd sit on the kitchen steps and think about the woman who'd stepped off that train in Silver Creek, terrified and scarred and convinced she was too broken to ever be whole. She'd been wrong about that. Not about being broken. The scars were real, the damage was real. The trauma didn't just disappear because she'd won in court. But she'd been wrong about what broken meant. Being broken didn't mean being worthless. It meant being human. Everyone carried damage. Everyone had scars, visible or not. The measure of a person wasn't whether they'd been hurt, but what they built from the ruins. Leora had built a family, a business, a life that was entirely, completely hers. And that was worth every terrifying step it had taken to get here. Years later, when Blackthorn Ranch had grown into one of the most successful enterprises in the territory, when the bakery employed 30 women and produced bread that shipped as far as San Francisco, when Elsie was grown with children of her own, people would ask Lyora for the secret. How did you do it, they'd ask. How did you escape and survive and build all this? And she'd think about that question carefully, because the answer mattered. She could tell them about the bread, about finding the right recipes and scaling production and building customer relationships. That was part of it. She could tell them about Rowan and the ranch hands and Patricia and everyone who'd stood beside her, about the power of community and loyalty and people choosing to fight for you. That was part of it too. But the real answer was simpler and harder than either of those things. I stopped believing that survival was the best I deserved, she'd say. I stopped accepting other people's definitions of my worth, and I started building the life I wanted instead of running from the one I feared, because that was the truth that mattered. Not that she'd been strong or brave or special, but that she'd been desperate enough to try, stubborn enough to keep trying when it got hard, and lucky enough to find people who saw her value when she couldn't see it herself. Survival wasn't about being perfect. It was about showing up, day after day, even when you were terrified, even when you were broken, even when the odds said you couldn't possibly win. It was about making bread at 4 a.m. because people depended on you, about holding scared children through nightmares, about standing up to monsters even when your hands shook, about choosing love over fear, over and over, until one day you realized the fear had gotten quieter and the love had gotten louder. That was what Lyora had learned in the brutal Montana winters, and the desperate fights and the slow, painful healing that came after. That being human meant being imperfect, that being strong meant asking for help, that being free meant choosing every day to build something instead of just avoiding destruction, and that sometimes, when you were lucky and stubborn and surrounded by people who refused to let you fall, broken things could be rebuilt into something even more beautiful than they'd been before the breaking. Standing on the porch of Blackthorn Ranch decades later, gray-haired and content, surrounded by the family she'd built and the legacy she'd created, Lyora understood something she'd never imagined possible during those terrifying months of running. She hadn't just survived Vincent. She'd outlived him in every way that mattered. He was locked in a cell, still trying to control a world that had moved on without him. She was standing in the middle of a life she'd built from nothing, surrounded by love she'd never thought she deserved, holding the hand of a man who'd seen her at her worst and chosen her anyway. And that simple, imperfect, beautiful reality was the greatest revenge she could have ever imagined. Not because she'd destroyed him, but because she'd built something he could never touch. A life that was entirely, wonderfully, perfectly hers.